अस्सलाम अलैकुम मेरे प्यारे दोस्तों।
History of Israel. The history of Israel covers an area of the southern Levant also known as Canaan, Palestine, or the Holy Land, which is the geographical location of the modern states of Israel and Palestine. From a prehistory as part of the critical Levantine corridor, which witnessed waves of early humans out of Africa, to the emergence of Natufian culture c. 10th millennium BCE, the region entered the Bronze Age c. 2000 BCE with the development of Canaanite civilization, before being vassalized by Egypt in the Late Bronze Age. In the Iron Age, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were established, entities that were central to the origins of the Jewish and Samaritan peoples as well as the Abrahamic faith tradition. This has given rise to Judaism, Samaritanism, Christianity, Islam, Druzism, Baha'ism, and a variety of other religious movements. Throughout the course of human history, the land of Israel has come under the sway or control of various polities and, as a result, it has historically hosted a wide variety of ethnic groups. In the following centuries, the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires conquered the region. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids vied for control over the region during the Hellenistic period. However, with the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, the local Jewish population maintained independence for a century before being incorporated into the Roman Republic. As a result of the Jewish-Roman wars in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, many Jews were killed, displaced, or sold into slavery. Following the advent of Christianity, which was adopted by the Greco-Roman world under the influence of the Roman Empire, the region's demographics shifted towards newfound Christians, who replaced Jews as the majority of the population by the 4th century. However, shortly after Islam was consolidated across the Arabian Peninsula under Muhammad, Byzantine Christian rule over the land of Israel was superseded by the Arab conquest of the Levant in the 7th century. From the 11th century to the 13th century, the land of Israel became the center for intermittent religious wars between Christian and Muslim armies as part of the Crusades. In the 13th century, the land of Israel became subject to the Mongol invasions and conquests, though these were locally rooted by the Mamluk Sultanate, under whose rule it remained until the 16th century. The Mamluks were eventually defeated by the Ottoman Empire, and the region became an Ottoman province until the 20th century. The late 19th century saw the widespread consolidation of a Jewish nationalist movement known as Zionism, as part of which Aliyah, Jewish return to the land of Israel from the Diaspora, increased. During World War I, the Sinai and Palestine campaign of the Allies led to the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire. Britain was granted control of the region by League of Nations mandate, in what became known as Mandatory Palestine. The British government publicly committed itself to the creation of a Jewish homeland. Arab nationalism opposed this design, asserting Arab rights over the former Ottoman territories and seeking to prevent Jewish migration. As a result, Arab-Jewish tensions grew in the succeeding decades of British administration. In 1948, the Israeli Declaration of Independence sparked the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which resulted in the 1948 Palestinian expulsion and flight and subsequently led to waves of Jewish emigration from other parts of the Middle East. Today, approximately 43% of the global Jewish population resides in Israel. In 1979, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed, based on the Camp David Accords. In 1993, Israel signed the Oslo I Accord with the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was followed by the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority. In 1994, the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed. Despite efforts to finalize the peace agreement, the conflict continues to play a major role in Israeli and international political, social, and economic life. Prehistory. The oldest evidence of early humans in the territory of modern Israel, dating to 1.5 million years ago, was found in Euboea near the Sea of Galilee. Flint tool artifacts have been discovered at Uran, the oldest stone tools found anywhere outside Africa. Other groups include 1.4 million years old Acheulean industry, the Bezit Ruhama group and Gesher Bnot Yaakov. In the Mount Carmel area at El Tabun, an ES school, Neanderthal and early modern human remains were found, showing the longest stratigraphic record in the region, spanning 600,000 years of human activity, from the Lower Paleolithic to the present day, representing roughly 1 million years of human evolution. Other notable Paleolithic sites include caves Kezem and Minot. The oldest fossils of anatomically modern humans found outside Africa are the School and Kafze hominids, who lived in northern Israel 120,000 years ago. Around 10th millennium BCE, the Natufian culture existed in the area. Canaan. The Canaanites are archaeologically attested in the Middle Bronze Age, 2115–50 BCE. There were probably independent or semi-independent city-states. Cities were often surrounded by massive earthworks, resulting in the archaeological mounds, or tells common in the region today. In the late Middle Bronze Age, the Nile Delta in Egypt was settled by Canaanites who maintained close connections with Canaan. During that period, the Hyksos, dynasties of Canaanite/Asiatic origin, ruled much of Lower Egypt before being overthrown in the 16th century BCE. During the Late Bronze Age, 1550–1200 BCE, there were Canaanite vassal states paying tribute to the new Kingdom of Egypt, which governed from Gaza. In 1457 BCE, Egyptian forces under the command of Pharaoh Thutmose III defeated a rebellious coalition of Canaanite vassal states led by Kadesh's king at the Battle of Megiddo. In the Late Bronze Age there was a period of civilizational collapse in the Middle East. Canaan fell into chaos, and Egyptian control ended. There is evidence that urban centers such as Hazor, Beit Shean, Megiddo, Ekron, Istud, and Ascalon were damaged or destroyed. Two groups appear at this time, and are associated with the transition to the Iron Age. They used iron weapons/tools which were better than earlier bronze. The Sea peoples, particularly the Philistines, who migrated from the Aegean world and settled on the southern coast, and the Israelites, whose settlements dotted the highlands. Some second millennium inscriptions about the semi-nomadic Habaru people are believed to be connected to the Hebrews, who were generally synonymous with the biblical Israelites. Many scholars regard this connection to be plausible since the two ethnonyms have similar etymologies, although others argue that Habaru refers to a social class found in every Near Eastern society, including Hebrew societies. Ancient Israel and Judah. Early Israelites, Iron Age I. The earliest recorded evidence of a people by the name of Israel, as YSRR, occurs in the Egyptian Merneptah stele, erected for Pharaoh Merneptah, son of Ramesses II, c. 1209 BCE, which states Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. Archaeological evidence indicates that during the early Iron Age I, hundreds of small villages were established on the highlands of Canaan on both sides of the Jordan River, primarily in Samaria, north of Jerusalem. These villages had populations of up to 400, were largely self-sufficient and lived from herding, grain cultivation, and growing vines and olives with some economic interchange. The pottery was plain and undecorated. Writing was known and available for recording, even in small sites. William G. Dever sees this Israel in the Central Highlands as a cultural and probably political entity, more an ethnic group rather than an organized state. Modern scholars believe that the Israelites and their culture branched out of the Canaanite peoples and their cultures through the development of a distinct monolatristic and later monotheistic religion centered on a national god Yahweh. According to McNutt, it is probably safe to assume that sometime during Iron Age a population began to identify itself as Israelite, differentiating itself from the Canaanites through such markers as the prohibition of intermarriage, an emphasis on family history and genealogy, and religion. Philistine cooking tools and the prevalence of pork in their diets, and locally made Mycenaean pottery which later evolved into Bikram Philistine pottery all support their foreign origin. Their cities were large and elaborate, which together with the findings point out to a complex, hierarchical society. A stele of Seti I found in Beth Shean, dating to ca. 1289 BCE, revealed that a Raham tribe lived in Israel. They were named after the biblical Abraham. Israel Finkelstein believes that the oldest Abraham traditions originated in the Iron Age, which focus on the themes of land and offspring and possibly, his altars in Hebron. Abraham's Mesopotamian heritage is not discussed. Israel and Judah, Iron Age II. In the 10th century BCE, the Israelite kingdoms of Judah and Israel emerged. The Hebrew Bible states that these were preceded by a single kingdom ruled by Saul, David, and Solomon, who is said to have built the first temple. Archaeologists have debated whether the united monarchy ever existed, with those in favor of such a polity existing further divided between maximalists who support the biblical accounts, and minimalists who argue that any such polity was likely smaller than suggested. Historians and archaeologists agree that the northern kingdom of Israel existed by ca. 900 BCE and the kingdom of Judah existed by ca. 850 BCE. The kingdom of Israel was the more prosperous of the two kingdoms and soon developed into a regional power. During the days of the Omride dynasty, it controlled Samaria, Galilee, the Upper Jordan Valley, the Sharon, and large parts of the Transjordan. Samaria, the capital, was home to one of the largest Iron Age structures in the Levant. The Kingdom of Israel's capital moved between Shechem, Penuel, and Tirzah before Omri settled it in Samaria, and the royal succession was often settled by a military coup d'état. The Kingdom of Judah was smaller but more stable. The Davidic dynasty ruled the kingdom for the 4 centuries of its existence, with the capital always in Jerusalem, controlling the Judean mountains, most of the Shephelah and the Beer-sheba valley in the northern Negev. In 854 BCE, according to Assyrian records, the Kirk monoliths, an alliance between Ahab of Israel and Ben-Hadad II of Aram Damascus, managed to repulse the incursions of the Assyrians, with a victory at the Battle of Karkar. This is not reported in the Bible, which describes conflict between Ahab and Ben-Hadad. Another important discovery of the period is the Mesha stele, a Moabite stele found in Tehibon when Emir Saddam al-Fayez led Henry Tristram to it as they toured the lands of the vassals of the Bani Sakr. The stele is now in the Louvre. In the stele, Mesha, king of Moab, tells how Chemosh, the god of Moab, had been angry with his people and had allowed them to be subjugated to the kingdom of Israel, but at length, Chemosh returned and assisted Mesha to throw off the yoke of Israel and restore the lands of Moab. It refers to Omri, king of Israel, to the god Yahweh, and may contain another early reference to the house of David. Jehu, son of Omri, is referenced by the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. Assyrian invasions. Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria invaded Israel in around 732 BCE. The kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians following a long siege of the capital Samaria around 720 BCE. The records of Sargon II of Assyria indicate that he captured Samaria and deported 27,290 inhabitants to Mesopotamia. It is likely that Shalmaneser captured the city since both the Babylonian Chronicles and the Hebrew Bible viewed the fall of Israel as the signature event of his reign. The Assyrian deportations became the basis for the Jewish idea of the 10 lost tribes. Foreign groups were settled by the Assyrians in the territories of the fallen kingdom. The Samaritans claim to be descended from Israelites of ancient Samaria who were not expelled by the Assyrians. It is believed that refugees from the destruction of Israel moved to Judah, massively expanding Jerusalem and leading to construction of the Siloam Tunnel during the rule of King Hezekiah, ruled 715–686 BCE. The tunnel could provide water during a siege and its construction is described in the Bible. The Siloam inscription, a plaque written in Hebrew left by the construction team, was discovered in the tunnel in 1880s, and is today held by the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. During Hezekiah's rule, Sennacherib, the son of Sargon, attempted but failed to capture Judah. Assyrian records say that Sennacherib leveled 46 walled cities and besieged Jerusalem, leaving after receiving extensive tribute. Sennacherib erected the Lachish reliefs in Nineveh to commemorate a second victory at Lachish. Hezekiah, king of Judah, royal seal written in the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, unearthed in Jerusalem. The writings of 4 different prophets are believed to date from this period: Hosea and Amos in Israel and Micah and Isaiah of Judah. These men were mostly social critics who warned of the Assyrian threat and acted as religious spokesmen. They exercised some form of free speech and may have played a significant social and political role in Israel and Judah. They urged rulers and the general populace to adhere to God-conscious ethical ideals, seeing the Assyrian invasions as a divine punishment of the collective resulting from ethical failures. Under King Josiah, ruler from 641–619 BCE, the Book of Deuteronomy was either rediscovered or written. The Book of Joshua and the accounts of the kingship of David and Solomon in the Book of Kings are believed to have the same author. The books are known as Deuteronomist and considered to be a key step in the emergence of monotheism in Judah. They emerged at a time that Assyria was weakened by the emergence of Babylon and may be a committing to text of pre-writing verbal traditions. Babylonian period, 587–538 BCE. First revolt, 597 defeat. During the late 7th century BCE, Judah became a vassal state of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In 601 BCE, Jehoiakim of Judah allied with Babylon's principal rival, Egypt, despite the strong remonstrances of the prophet Jeremiah. As a punishment, the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem in 597 BCE, and the city surrendered. The defeat was recorded by the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar pillaged Jerusalem and deported King Jehoiakim, Jeconiah, along with other prominent citizens, to Babylon. Zedekiah, his uncle, was installed as king. A few years later, Zedekiah launched another revolt against Babylon, and an army was sent to conquer Jerusalem. Second Revolt, 587–86 defeat. In 587 or 586 BCE, King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the first temple and razed the city. The kingdom of Judah was abolished, and many of its citizens were exiled to Babylon. The former territory of Judah became a Babylonian province called Yehud with its center in Mizpah, north of the destroyed Jerusalem. Babylonian Diaspora after 587–86 BCE. Tablets that describe King Jehoiachin's rations were found in the ruins of Babylon. He was eventually released by the Babylonians. According to both the Bible and the Talmud, the Davidic dynasty continued as head of Babylonian Jewry, called the Rosh Galu, exilarch or head of exile. Arab and Jewish sources show that the Rosh Galu continued to exist for another 1,500 years in what is now Iraq, ending in the 11th century. Second Temple period. Persian period, 538–332 BCE. N 538 BCE, Cyrus the Great of the Achaemenid Empire conquered Babylon and took over its empire. Cyrus issued a proclamation granting religious freedom to all peoples subjugated by the Babylonians. See the Cyrus Cylinder. According to the Bible, Jewish exiles in Babylon, including 50,000 Judeans led by Zerubbabel, returned to Judah to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The Second Temple was subsequently completed c. 515 BCE. A second group of 5,000, led by Ezra and Nehemiah, returned to Judah in 456 BCE. The first was empowered by the Persian king to enforce religious rules, the second had the status of governor and a royal mission to restore the walls of the city. The country remained a province of the Achaemenid Empire called Yehud until 332 BCE. The final text of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is thought to have been written during the Persian period, probably 450–350 BCE. The text was formed by editing and unifying earlier texts. The returning Israelites adopted an Aramaic script, also known as the Ashuri alphabet, which they brought back from Babylon. This is the current Hebrew script. The Hebrew calendar closely resembles the Babylonian calendar and probably dates from this period. The Bible describes tension between the returnees, the elite of the First Temple period, and those who had remained in Judah. It is possible that the returnees, supported by the Persian monarchy, became large landholders at the expense of the people who had remained to work the land in Judah, whose opposition to the Second Temple would have reflected a fear that exclusion from the cult would deprive them of land rights. Judah had become in practice a theocracy, ruled by hereditary high priests and a Persian-appointed governor, frequently Jewish, charged with keeping order and seeing that tribute was paid. A Judean military garrison was placed by the Persians on Elephantine Island near Aswan in Egypt. In the early 20th century, 175 papyrus documents recording activity in this community were discovered, including the Passover Papyrus, a letter instructing the garrison on how to correctly conduct the Passover feast. Hellenistic period, 330–364 BCE. Main article, Hasmonean dynasty. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great of Macedon conquered the region as part of his campaign against the Persian Empire. After his death in 322 BCE, his generals divided the empire and Judea became a frontier region between the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt. 93 Following a century of Ptolemaic rule, Judea was conquered by the Seleucid Empire in 200 BCE at the Battle of Panium. Hellenistic rulers generally respected Jewish culture and protected Jewish institutions. Judea was ruled by the hereditary office of the High Priest of Israel as a Hellenistic vassal. Nevertheless, the region underwent a process of Hellenization, which heightened tensions between Greeks, Hellenized Jews, and observant Jews. These tensions escalated into clashes involving a power struggle for the position of high priest and the character of the holy city of Jerusalem. When Antiochus IV Epiphanes consecrated the temple, forbade Jewish practices, and forcibly imposed Hellenistic norms on the Jews, several centuries of religious tolerance under Hellenistic control came to an end. In 167 BCE, the Maccabean revolt erupted after Mattathias, a Jewish priest of the Hasmonean lineage, killed a Hellenized Jew and a Seleucid official who participated in sacrifice to the Greek gods in Modi'in. His son Judas Maccabeus defeated the Seleucids in several battles, and in 164 BCE, he captured Jerusalem and restored temple worship, an event commemorated by the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. After Judas' death, his brothers Jonathan Aphus and Simon Thassi were able to establish and consolidate a vassal Hasmonean state in Judea, capitalizing on the Seleucid Empire's decline as a result of internal instability and wars with the Parthians, and by forging ties with the rising Roman Republic. Hasmonean leader John Hyrcanus was able to gain independence, doubling Judea's territories. He took control of Idumea, where he converted the Edomites to Judaism, and invaded Scythopolis and Samaria, where he demolished the Samaritan temple. Hyrcanus was also the first Hasmonean leader to mint coins. Under his sons, Kings Aristobulus I and Alexander Jannaeus, Hasmonean Judea became a kingdom, and its territories continued to expand, now also covering the coastal plain, Galilee and parts of the Transjordan. Some scholars argue that the Hasmonean dynasty also institutionalized the final Jewish biblical canon. Under Hasmonean rule, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the mystic Essenes emerged as the principal Jewish social movements. The Pharisee sage Simeon ben Shaddach is credited with establishing the first schools based around meeting houses. This was a key step in the emergence of rabbinical Judaism. After Jannaeus' widow, Queen Salome Alexandra, died in 67 BCE, her sons Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II engaged in a civil war over succession. The conflicting parties requested Pompey's assistance on their behalf, which paved the way for a Roman takeover of the kingdom. Early Roman period, 64 BCE to ND century CE. In 64 BCE the Roman general Pompey conquered Syria and intervened in the Hasmonean civil war in Jerusalem, restoring Hyrcanus II as high priest and making Judea a Roman vassal kingdom. During the siege of Alexandria in 47 BCE, the lives of Julius Caesar and his protégé Cleopatra were saved by 3,000 Jewish troops sent by Hyrcanus II and commanded by Antipater, whose descendants Caesar made kings of Judea. From 37 BCE to 6 CE, the Herodian dynasty, Jewish Roman client kings of Edomite origin, descended from Antipater, ruled Judea. Herod the Great considerably enlarged the temple, see Herod's Temple, making it one of the largest religious structures in the world. At this time, Jews formed as much as 10% of the population of the entire Roman Empire, with large communities in North Africa and Arabia. Augustus made Judea a Roman province in 6 CE, deposing the last Jewish king, Herod Archelaus, and appointing a Roman governor. There was a small revolt against Roman taxation led by Judas of Galilee, and over the next decades tensions grew between the Greco-Roman and Judean population centered on attempts to place effigies of Emperor Caligula in synagogues and in the Jewish temple. In 64 CE, the temple high priest Joshua ben Gamla introduced a religious requirement for Jewish boys to learn to read from the age of 6. Over the next few hundred years this requirement became steadily more ingrained in Jewish tradition. The latter part of the Second Temple period was marked by social unrest and religious turmoil, and messianic expectations filled the atmosphere. Jewish-Roman Wars. In 66 CE, the First Jewish-Roman War, 66-73 CE, broke out due to the repressive rule of Roman governors, growing hostility between the wealthy nobles and the impoverished masses, clashes between Jews and pagans in mixed cities, and tensions between the Roman and Jewish religions. The revolting Jews named their state Israel. Despite early Jewish victories, the provisional government quickly collapsed, and Jews were split up into several warring factions with conflicting agendas. Eventually, the Roman army under the command of future emperors Vespasian and his son Titus besieged and destroyed the major Jewish strongholds one by one, including the cities of Yodfat, Gamla, and the fortress of Masada. After a brutal 5-month siege in 70 CE, Jerusalem and the Second Temple were completely destroyed. The revolt's failure had profound demographic, theological, political, and economic consequences. Many Jews died fighting and under siege during the revolt, and a sizable portion of the population was either expelled from the country or displaced. Without the temple, Judaism had to change to ensure its survival. Judaism's temple-based sects, most notably the Sadducees, vanished. The Pharisees, led by Yochanan ben Zakkai, obtained Roman permission to establish a school at Yavne. Their teachings became the foundational, liturgical, and ritualistic basis for Rabbinic Judaism, which eventually became the mainstream form of Judaism. From 115 to 117, tensions and attacks on Jews around the Roman Empire led to a massive Jewish uprising against Rome, known as the Kittos War. Jews in Libya, Egypt, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia fought against Rome. This conflict was accompanied by large-scale massacres of both sides. Cyprus was so severely depopulated that new settlers were imported and Jews banned from living there. In 132 CE, the Bar Kokhba revolt erupted. The uprising was led by a Jew named Simon Bar Kokhba, who ruled as Nasi, and was viewed by some of the rabbis of the period as the long-awaited Messiah. Based on the Bar Kokhba revolt coinage, the independent Jewish state was named Israel. It has been suggested that a rabbinical assembly which convened during the revolt decided which books could be regarded as part of the Hebrew Bible. The Jewish Apocrypha and Christian books were excluded. As a result, the original text of some Hebrew texts, including the books of Maccabees, were lost. Greek translations survived. A rabbi of this period, Simeon Bar Yochai, is regarded as the author of the Zohar, the foundational text for Kabbalistic thought. However, modern scholars believe it was written in medieval Spain. Christians refused to participate in the revolt, and from this point the Jews regarded Christianity as a separate religion. The Bar Kokhba revolt was eventually crushed by Emperor Hadrian himself, with serious losses. Today, it is viewed by modern scholars as having decisive historic importance. According to Cassius Dio, writing in the century following the revolt, 50 of the Jews' most important outposts and 985 of their most famous villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire was past finding out, thus nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. While scholars debate whether these numbers are accurate, archaeological surveys and excavations appear to confirm the claim of Cassius Dio that the district of Judea was largely depopulated. Most scholars agree that, in contrast to the aftermath of the First Jewish-Roman War, Judea was devastated after the Bar Kokhba revolt, with many Jews killed, exiled, or sold into slavery. Around the time of the revolt, the province of Judea, Iudea, was renamed Syria Palestina. The commonly held view is that it was implemented as punishment for the Bar Kokhba revolt or to disassociate the Jewish people from their historical homeland and hold Hadrian accountable. However, no evidence exists for this narrative, and it has been disputed by scholars in recent years. No other revolt led to a province being renamed. Late Roman and Byzantine periods. Late Roman period, 136–390. Further information: Syria Palestina, rabbinic literature, and persecution of pagans in the late Roman Empire. As a result of the disastrous effects of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jewish presence in the region significantly dwindled. Over the next centuries, more Jews left to communities in the diaspora, especially the large, speedily growing Jewish communities in Babylonia and Arabia. Others remained in the land of Israel, where the spiritual and demographic centers shifted from the depopulated Judea to Galilee. Jewish presence also continued in the southern Hebron Hills, in Ein Gedi, and on the coastal plain. The Mishnah and the Jerusalem Talmud, huge compendiums of rabbinical discussions, were compiled during the 2nd to 4th centuries CE in Tiberias and Jerusalem. Following the revolt, Judea's countryside was penetrated by pagan populations, including migrants from the nearby provinces of Syria, Phoenicia, and Arabia, whereas Aelia Capitolina, its immediate vicinity, and administrative centers were now inhabited by Roman veterans and settlers from the western parts of the empire. The Romans permitted a hereditary rabbinical patriarch from the house of Hillel, called the Nasi, to represent the Jews in dealings with the Romans. One prominent figure was Judah HaNasi, credited with compiling the final version of the Mishnah, a vast collection of Jewish oral traditions. He also emphasized the importance of education in Judaism, leading to requirements that illiterate Jews be treated as outcasts. This might have contributed to some illiterate Jews converting to Christianity. Jewish seminaries, such as those at Shepharim and Bet Shirim, continued to produce scholars. The best of these became members of the Sanhedrin, which was located first at Sepphoris and later at Tiberias. In the Galilee, many synagogues have been found dating from this period, and the burial site of the Sanhedrin leaders was discovered in Beit She'arim. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire faced an economic crisis and imposed heavy taxation to fund wars of imperial succession. This situation prompted additional Jewish migration from Syria Palestina to the Sasanian Empire, known for its more tolerant environment. There, a flourishing Jewish community with important Talmudic academies thrived in Babylonia, engaging in a notable rivalry with the Talmudic academies of Palestina. Early in the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine made Constantinople the capital of the East Roman Empire and made Christianity an accepted religion. His mother Helena made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, 326–328, and led the construction of the Church of the Nativity, birthplace of Jesus in Bethlehem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, burial site of Jesus in Jerusalem, and other key churches that still exist. The name Jerusalem was restored to Aelia Capitolina and became a Christian city. Jews were still banned from living in Jerusalem, but were allowed to visit and worship at the site of the ruined temple. Over the course of the next century, Christians worked to eradicate paganism, leading to the destruction of classical Roman traditions and eradication of their temples. In 351–2, another Jewish revolt in the Galilee erupted against a corrupt Roman governor. Byzantine period, 396–34. The Roman Empire split in 390 CE and the region became part of the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire. Under Byzantine rule, much of the region and its non-Jewish population were won over by Christianity, which eventually became the dominant religion in the region. The presence of holy sites drew Christian pilgrims, some of whom chose to settle, contributing to the rise of a Christian majority. Christian authorities encouraged this pilgrimage movement and appropriated lands, constructing magnificent churches at locations linked to biblical narratives. Additionally, monks established monasteries near pagan settlements, encouraging the conversion of local pagans. During the Byzantine period, the Jewish presence in the region declined, and it is believed that Jews lost their majority status in Palestine in the 4th century. 159 While Judaism remained the sole non-Christian religion tolerated, restrictions on Jews gradually increased, prohibiting the construction of new places of worship, holding public office, or owning Christian slaves. In 425, after the death of the last Nasi, Gamliel VI, the Nasi office and the Sanhedrin were officially abolished, and the standing of yeshivot weakened. The leadership void was gradually filled by the Jewish center in Babylonia, which would assume a leading role in the Jewish world for generations after the Byzantine period. During the 5th and 6th centuries CE, the region witnessed a series of Samaritan revolts against Byzantine rule. Their suppression resulted in the decline of Samaritan presence and influence, and further consolidated Christian domination. Though it is acknowledged that some Jews and Samaritans converted to Christianity during the Byzantine period, the reliable historical records are limited, and they pertain to individual conversions rather than entire communities. In 611, Khosrow II, ruler of Sassanid Persia, invaded the Byzantine Empire. He was helped by Jewish fighters recruited by Benjamin of Tiberias and captured Jerusalem in 614. The True Cross was captured by the Persians. The Jewish Himyarite kingdom in Yemen may also have provided support. Nehemiah ben Hushiel was made governor of Jerusalem. Christian historians of the period claimed the Jews massacred Christians in the city, but there is no archaeological evidence of destruction, leading modern historians to question their accounts. In 628, Kavod II, son of Koro, returned Palestine and the True Cross to the Byzantines and signed a peace treaty with them. Following the Byzantine re-entry, Heraclius massacred the Jewish population of Galilee and Jerusalem, while renewing the ban on Jews entering the latter. Early Muslim period. The Levant was conquered by an Arab army under the command of Umar ibn al-Khattab in 635, and became the province of Bilad al-Sham of the Rashidun Caliphate. Two military districts, Jund Filastin and Jund al-Urdun, were established in Palestine. A new city called Ramla was built as the Muslim capital of Jund Filastin, while Tiberias served as the capital of Jund al-Urdun. The Byzantine ban on Jews living in Jerusalem came to an end. In 661, Muawiyah was crowned caliph in Jerusalem, becoming the first of the Damascus-based Umayyad dynasty. In 691, Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, 685–705, constructed the dome of the rock shrine on the Temple Mount, where the two Jewish temples had been located. A second building, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was also erected on the Temple Mount in 705. Both buildings were rebuilt in the 10th century following a series of earthquakes. In 750, Arab discrimination against non-Arab Muslims led to the Abbasid Revolution, and the Umayyads were replaced by the Abbasid caliphs, who built a new city, Baghdad, to be their capital. This period is known as the Islamic Golden Age. The Arab Empire was the largest in the world and Baghdad the largest and richest city. Both Arabs and minorities prospered across the region and much scientific progress was made. There were, however, setbacks. During the 8th century, the Caliph Umar II introduced a law requiring Jews and Christians to wear identifying clothing. Jews were required to wear yellow stars round their neck and on their hats. Christians had to wear blue. Clothing regulations arose during repressive periods of Arab rule and were more designed to humiliate than persecute non-Muslims. A poll tax was imposed on all non-Muslims by Islamic rulers, and failure to pay could result in imprisonment or worse. In 982, Caliph Al-Aziz Billah of the Cairo-based Fatimid dynasty conquered the region. The Fatimids were followers of Ismailism, a branch of Shia Islam, and claimed descent from Fatima, Muhammad's daughter. Around the year 1010, the Church of Holy Sepulchre, believed to be Jesus' burial site, was destroyed by Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, who relented 10 years later and paid for it to be rebuilt. In 1020, al-Hakim claimed divine status, and the newly formed Druze religion gave him the status of a messiah. Demographic changes. Although the Arab conquest was relatively peaceful and did not cause widespread destruction, it did alter the country's demographics significantly. Over the ensuing several centuries, the region experienced a drastic decline in its population, from an estimated 1 million during Roman and Byzantine times to some 300,000 by the early Ottoman period. This demographic collapse was accompanied by a slow process of Islamization, that resulted from the flight of non-Muslim populations, immigration of Muslims, and local conversion. The majority of the remaining populace belonged to the lowest classes. While the Arab conquerors themselves left the area after the conquest and moved on to other places, the settlement of Arab tribes in the area both before and after the conquest also contributed to the Islamization. As a result, the Muslim population steadily grew and the area became gradually dominated by Muslims on a political and social level. During the early Islamic period, many Christians and Samaritans, belonging to the Byzantine upper class, migrated from the coastal cities to northern Syria and Cyprus, which were still under Byzantine control, while others fled to the central highlands and the Transjordan. As a result, the coastal towns, formerly important economic centers connected with the rest of the Byzantine world, were emptied of most of their residents. Some of these cities, namely Ashkelon, Acre, Arsuf, and Gaza, now fortified border towns, were resettled by Muslim populations, who developed them into significant Muslim centers. The region of Samaria also underwent a process of Islamization as a result of waves of conversion among the Samaritan population and the influx of Muslims into the area. The predominantly Jacobite Monophysitic Christian population had been hostile to Byzantium orthodoxy, and at times for that reason welcomed Muslim rule. There is no strong evidence for forced conversion, or for possibility that the jizya tax significantly affected such changes. The demographic situation in Palestine was further altered by urban decline under the Abbasids, and it is thought that the 749 earthquake hastened this process by causing an increase in the number of Jews, Christians, and Samaritans who emigrated to diaspora communities while also leaving behind others who remained in the devastated cities and poor villages until they converted to Islam. 140 historical records and archaeological evidence suggest that many Samaritans converted under Abbasid and Tulunid rule, after suffering through severe difficulties such droughts, earthquakes, religious persecution, heavy taxes, and anarchy. The same region also saw the settlement of Arabs. Over the period, the Samaritan population drastically decreased, with the rural Samaritan population converting to Islam, and small urban communities remaining in Nablus and Caesarea, as well as in Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Sarepta. Nevertheless, the Muslim population remained a minority in a predominantly Christian area, and it is likely that this status persisted until the Crusader period. Crusades and Mongols. In 1095, Pope Urban II called upon Christians to wage a holy war and recapture Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Responding to this call, Christians launched the First Crusade in the same year, a military campaign aimed at retaking the Holy Land, ultimately resulting in the successful siege and conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. In the same year, the Crusaders conquered Beit Shean and Tiberias, and in the following decade, they captured coastal cities with the support of Italian city-state fleets, establishing these coastal ports as crucial strongholds for Crusader rule in the region. Following the First Crusade, several Crusader states were established in the Levant, with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Regnum Hierosolymitanum, assuming a preeminent position and enjoying special status among them. The population consisted predominantly of Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Samaritans, while the Crusaders remained a minority and relied on the local population who worked the soil. The region saw the construction of numerous robust castles and fortresses, yet efforts to establish permanent European villages proved unsuccessful. Around 1180, Reynald of Chatillon, ruler of Transjordan, caused increasing conflict with the Ayyubid Sultan Saladin, Salah al-Din, leading to the defeat of the Crusaders in the 1187 Battle of Hattin, above Tiberias. Saladin was able to peacefully take Jerusalem and conquered most of the former Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin's court physician was Maimonides, a refugee from Almohad, Muslim, persecution in Córdoba, Spain, where all non-Muslim religions had been banned. The Christian world's response to the loss of Jerusalem came in the Third Crusade of 1190. After lengthy battles and negotiations, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin concluded the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192, whereby Christians were granted free passage to make pilgrimages to the holy sites, while Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule. In 1229, Jerusalem peacefully reverted into Christian control as part of a treaty between Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II and Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil that ended the Sixth Crusade. In 1244, Jerusalem was sacked by the Khwarezmian Tatars, who decimated the city's Christian population, drove out the Jews and razed the city. The Khwarezmians were driven out by the Ayyubids in 1247. Mamluk period. Between 1258 and 1291, the area was the frontier between Mongol invaders, occasional Crusader allies, and the Mamluks of Egypt. The conflict impoverished the country and severely reduced the population. In Egypt, a caste of warrior slaves, known as the Mamluks, gradually took control of the kingdom. The Mamluks were mostly of Turkish origin, and were bought as children and then trained in warfare. They were highly prized warriors, who gave rulers independence of the native aristocracy. In Egypt they took control of the kingdom following a failed invasion by the Crusaders, 7th Crusade. The first Mamluk Sultan, Qutuz of Egypt, defeated the Mongols in the Battle of Anjalut, Goliath's Spring near Ain Herod, ending the Mongol advances. He was assassinated by one of his generals, Bibars, who went on to eliminate most of the Crusader outposts. The Mamluks ruled Palestine until 1516, regarding it as part of Syria. In Hebron, Jews were banned from worshipping at the Cave of the Patriarchs, the second holiest site in Judaism. They were only allowed to enter 7 steps inside the site, and the ban remained in place until Israel assumed control of the West Bank in the 6 Days' War. Undue weight. Discuss the Egyptian Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil conquered the last outpost of Crusader rule in 1291. The Mamluks, continuing the policy of the Ayyubids, made the strategic decision to destroy the coastal area and to bring desolation to many of its cities, from Tyre in the north to Gaza in the south. Ports were destroyed and various materials were dumped to make them inoperable. The goal was to prevent attacks from the sea, given the fear of the return of the Crusaders. This had a long-term effect on those areas, which remained sparsely populated for centuries. The activity in that time concentrated more inland. With the 1492 expulsion of Jews from Spain and 1497 persecution of Jews and Muslims by Manuel I of Portugal, many Jews moved eastward, with some deciding to settle in the Mamluk Palestine. As a consequence, the local Jewish community underwent significant rejuvenation. The influx of Sephardic Jews began under Mamluk rule in the 15th century, and continued throughout the 16th century and especially after the Ottoman conquest. As city dwellers, the majority of Sephardic Jews preferred to settle in urban areas, mainly in Safed but also in Jerusalem, while the Musta Arbai community comprised the majority of the villagers' Jews. Ottoman period. Further information: History of the Jews in the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman Syria. Under the Mamluks, the area was a province of Bilad-e-Sham, Syria. It was conquered by Turkish Sultan Selim I in 1516–17, becoming a part of the province of Ottoman Syria for the next 4 centuries, first as the Damascus Eyalet and later as the Syria Vilayet, following the Tanzimat reorganization of 1864. Old Yishuv. With the more favorable conditions that followed the Ottoman conquest, the immigration of Jews fleeing Catholic Europe, which had already begun under Mamluk rule, continued, and soon an influx of exiled Sephardic Jews came to dominate the Jewish community in the area. In 1558, Selim II, 1566–1574, successor to Suleiman, whose wife Nurbanu Sultan was Jewish, gave control of Tiberias to Dona Gracia Mendez Nasi, one of the richest women in Europe and an escapee from the Inquisition. She encouraged Jewish refugees to settle in the area and established a Hebrew printing press. Safed became a center for study of the Kabbalah. Dona Nasi's nephew, Joseph Nasi, was made governor of Tiberias and he encouraged Jewish settlement from Italy. In 1660, a Druze power struggle led to the destruction of Safed and Tiberias. In the late 18th century, a local Arab Sheikh Zahir al-Umar created a de facto independent emirate in the Galilee. Ottoman attempts to subdue the sheikh failed, but after Zahir's death the Ottomans restored their rule in the area. In 1799, Napoleon briefly occupied the country and planned a proclamation inviting Jews to create a state. The proclamation was shelved following his defeat at Acre. In 1831, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, an Ottoman ruler who left the empire and tried to modernize Egypt, conquered Ottoman Syria and imposed conscription, leading to the Arab Revolt. In 1838, there was another Druze revolt. In 1839 Moses Montefiore met with Muhammad Pasha in Egypt and signed an agreement to establish 100–200 Jewish villages in the Damascus Eyalet of Ottoman Syria, but in 1840 the Egyptians withdrew before the deal was implemented, returning the area to Ottoman governorship. In 1844, Jews constituted the largest population group in Jerusalem. By 1896 Jews constituted an absolute majority in Jerusalem, but the overall population in Palestine was 88% Muslim and 9% Christian. Birth of Zionism. Main articles: History of Zionism and Mutasarrifate of Jerusalem. Between 1882 and 1903, approximately 35,000 Jews moved to Palestine, known as the First Aliyah. In the Russian Empire, Jews faced growing persecution and legal restrictions. Half the world's Jews lived in the Russian Empire, where they were restricted to living in the Pale of Settlement. Severe pogroms in the early 1880s and legal repression led to 2 million Jews emigrating from the Russian Empire. 1.5 million went to the United States. Popular destinations were also Germany, France, England, Holland, Argentina, and Palestine. Russian Jews established the Bilu and Hovevei Zion, Lovers of Zion, movements with the aim of settling in Palestine. In 1878, Russian Jewish emigrants established the village of Petah Tikva, the beginning of hope, followed by Rishon LE Zion, first to Zion, in 1882. The existing Ashkenazi Jewish communities were concentrated in the 4 holy cities, extremely poor and relied on donations, halakha, from groups abroad, while the new settlements were small farming communities, but still relied on funding by the French Baron, Edmond James de Rothschild, who sought to establish profitable enterprises. Many early migrants could not find work and left, but despite the problems, more settlements arose and the community grew. After the Ottoman conquest of Yemen in 1881, a large number of Yemenite Jews also emigrated to Palestine, often driven by Messianism. In 1896 Theodor Herzl published Der Judenstate, the Jewish State, in which he asserted that the solution to growing anti-Semitism in Europe, the so-called Jewish question, was to establish a Jewish state. In 1897, the World Zionist Organization was founded and the First Zionist Congress proclaimed its aim to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured under public law. The Congress chose Hatikva, the Hope, as its anthem. Between 1904 and 1914, around 40,000 Jews settled in the area now known as Israel, the Second Aliyah. In 1908 the World Zionist Organization set up the Palestine Bureau, also known as the Eretz Israel Office, in Jaffa and began to adopt a systematic Jewish settlement policy. In 1909, residents of Jaffa bought land outside the city walls and built the first entirely Hebrew-speaking town, Ahuzat Bayit, later renamed Tel Aviv. In 1915–1916, Talat Pasha of the Young Turks forced around 1 million Armenian Christians from their homes in eastern Turkey, marching them south through Syria, in what is now known as the Armenian Genocide. The number of dead is thought to be around 700,000. Hundreds of thousands were forcibly converted to Islam. A community of survivors settled in Jerusalem, one of whom developed the now iconic Armenian pottery. World War I. During World War I, most Jews supported the Germans because they were fighting the Russians, who were regarded as the Jews' main enemy. In Britain, the government sought Jewish support for the war effort for a variety of reasons, including an anti-Semitic perception of Jewish power in the Ottoman Empire's Young Turks movement, which was based in Thessaloniki, the most Jewish city in Europe. 40% of the 160,000 population were Jewish. The British also hoped to secure American Jewish support for U.S. intervention on Britain's behalf. There was already sympathy for the aims of Zionism in the British government, including the Prime Minister Lloyd George. Over 14,000 Jews were expelled by the Ottoman military commander from the Jaffa area in 1914–1915, due to suspicions they were subjects of Russia, an enemy, or Zionists wishing to detach Palestine from the Ottoman Empire, and when the entire population, including Muslims, of both Jaffa and Tel Aviv was subject to an expulsion order in April 1917, the affected Jews could not return until the British conquest ended in 1918, which drove the Turks out of southern Syria. A year prior, in 1917, the British Foreign Minister, Arthur Balfour, sent a public letter to the British Lord Rothschild, a leading member of his party and leader of the Jewish community. The letter subsequently became known as the Balfour Declaration. It stated that the British government viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The declaration provided the British government with a pretext for claiming and governing the country. New Middle Eastern boundaries were decided by an agreement between British and French bureaucrats. A Jewish legion composed largely of Zionist volunteers organized by Zeev Jabotinsky and Joseph Trumpeldor participated in the British invasion. It also participated in the failed Gallipoli campaign. The Nili Zionist spy network provided the British with details of Ottoman plans and troop concentrations. After pushing out the Ottomans, Palestine came under martial law. The British, French, and Arab-occupied enemy territory administration governed the area shortly before the armistice with the Ottomans until the promulgation of the Mandate in 1920. Mandatory Palestine. Main article: Mandatory Palestine. First years. See also, History of Zionism. The British Mandate, in effect, British rule, of Palestine, including the Balfour Declaration, was confirmed by the League of Nations in 1922 and came into effect in 1923. The territory of Transjordan was also covered by the Mandate but under separate rules that excluded it from the Balfour Declaration. Britain signed a treaty with the United States, which did not join the League of Nations, in which the United States endorsed the terms of the Mandate, which was approved unanimously by both the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. The Balfour Declaration was published on 2 November 1917 and the Bolsheviks seized control of Russia a week later. This led to civil war in the Russian Empire. Between 1918 and 1921, a series of pogroms led to the death of at least 100,000 Jews, mainly in what is now Ukraine, and the displacement as refugees of a further 600,000. This led to further migration to Palestine. Between 1919 and 1923, some 40,000 Jews arrived in Palestine in what is known as the Third Aliyah. Many of the Jewish immigrants of this period were socialist Zionists and supported the Bolsheviks. The migrants became known as pioneers, halutzim, experienced or trained in agriculture who established self-sustaining communes called kibbutzim. Malarial marshes in the Jezreel Valley and Hagar Plain were drained and converted to agricultural use. Land was bought by the Jewish National Fund, a Zionist charity that collected money abroad for that purpose. After the French victory over the Arab Kingdom of Syria ended hopes of Arab independence, there were clashes between Arabs and Jews in Jerusalem during the 1920 Nebi Musa riots and in Jaffa the following year, leading to the establishment of the Haganah underground Jewish militia. A Jewish agency was created which issued the entry permits granted by the British and distributed funds donated by Jews abroad. Between 1924 and 1929, over 80,000 Jews arrived in the Fourth Aliyah, fleeing anti-Semitism and heavy tax burdens imposed on trade in Poland and Hungary, inspired by Zionism and motivated by the closure of United States borders by the Immigration Act of 1924, which severely limited immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Pinchas Rutenberg, a former commissar of St. Petersburg in Russia's pre-Bolshevik Kerensky government, built the first electricity generators in Palestine. In 1925 the Jewish Agency established the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and the Technion, Technological University, in Haifa. British authorities introduced the Palestine pound, worth 1,000 mils, in 1927, replacing the Egyptian pound as the unit of currency in the Mandate. From 1928, the democratically elected Va Adlumi, Jewish National Council or JNC, became the main administrative institution of the Palestine Jewish community, Yishuv, and included non-Zionist Jews. As the Yishuv grew, the JNC adopted more government-type functions, such as education, health care, and security. With British permission, the Va Adlumi raised its own taxes and ran independent services for the Jewish population. In 1929 tensions grew over the Kotel, Wailing Wall, the holiest spot in the world for modern Judaism citation needed, which was then a narrow alleyway where the British banned Jews from using chairs or curtains. Many of the worshippers were elderly and needed seats. They also wanted to separate women from men. The Mufti of Jerusalem said it was Muslim property and deliberately had cattle driven through the alley. Citation needed. He alleged that the Jews were seeking control of the Temple Mount. This provided the spark for the August 1929 Palestine riots. The main victims were the non-Zionist, ancient Jewish community at Hebron, who were massacred. The riots led to right-wing Zionists establishing their own militia in 1931, the Irgun Tzvei Leumi, National Military Organization, known in Hebrew by its acronym Etzel, which was committed to a more aggressive policy towards the Arab population. During the interwar period, the perception grew that there was an irreconcilable tension between the two mandatory functions, of providing for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and the goal of preparing the country for self-determination. The British rejected the principle of majority rule or any other measure that would give the Arab population, who formed the majority of the population, control over Palestinian territory. Increase in Jewish immigration. Main articles: Fifth Aliyah, Nuremberg Laws, and Tripartite Pact. Between 1929 and 1938, 250,000 Jews arrived in Palestine, Fifth Aliyah. In 1933, the Jewish Agency and the Nazis negotiated the Ha'avara Agreement, transfer agreement, under which 50,000 German Jews would be transferred to Palestine. The Jews' possessions were confiscated, and in return the Nazis allowed the Ha'avara organization to purchase £14 million worth of German goods for export to Palestine and use it to compensate the immigrants. Although many Jews wanted to leave Nazi Germany, the Nazis prevented Jews from taking any money and restricted them to 2 suitcases so few could pay the British entry tax, and many were afraid to leave. Citation needed. The agreement was controversial, and the labor Zionist leader who negotiated the agreement, Chaim Arlazorov, was assassinated in Tel Aviv in 1933. The assassination was used by the British to create tension between the Zionist left and the Zionist right. Citation needed. Arlazorov had been the boyfriend of Magda Ritschl some years before she married Joseph Goebbels. There has been speculation that he was assassinated by the Nazis to hide the connection, but there is no evidence for it. Between 1933 and 1936, 174,000 arrived. Despite the large sums the British demanded for immigration permits, Jews had to prove they had £1,000 for families with capital, equivalent to £72,286 in 2021, £500 if they had a profession and £250 if they were skilled labourers. Arab Revolt and the White Paper. Jewish immigration and Nazi propaganda contributed to the large-scale 1936–1939 Arab Revolt in Palestine, a largely nationalist uprising directed at ending British rule. The head of the Jewish Agency, Ben-Gurion, responded to the Arab Revolt with a policy of havlaga, self-restraint, and a refusal to be provoked by Arab attacks in order to prevent polarization. The Etzel group broke off from the Haganah in opposition to this policy. The British responded to the revolt with the Peel Commission, 1936–37, a public inquiry that recommended that an exclusively Jewish territory be created in the Galilee and Western Coast, including the population transfer of 225,000 Arabs, the rest becoming an exclusively Arab area. The 2 main Jewish leaders, Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, had convinced the Zionist Congress to approve equivocally the Peel recommendations as a basis for more negotiation. The plan was rejected outright by the Palestinian Arab leadership, and they renewed the revolt, which caused the British to appease the Arabs, and to abandon the plan as unworkable. Testifying before the Peel Commission, Weizmann said there are in Europe 6 million people, for whom the world is divided into places where they cannot live and places where they cannot enter. 238. In 1938, the U.S. called an international conference to address the question of the vast numbers of Jews trying to escape Europe. Britain made its attendance contingent on Palestine being kept out of the discussion. 239 No Jewish representatives were invited. The Nazis proposed their own solution, that the Jews of Europe be shipped to Madagascar, the Madagascar Plan. The agreement proved fruitless, and the Jews were stuck in Europe. With millions of Jews trying to leave Europe and every country in the world closed to Jewish migration, the British decided to close Palestine. The White Paper of 1939 recommended that an independent Palestine, governed jointly by Arabs and Jews, be established within 10 years. The White Paper agreed to allow 75,000 Jewish immigrants into Palestine over the period 1940–44, after which migration would require Arab approval. Both the Arab and Jewish leadership rejected the White Paper. In March 1940, the British High Commissioner for Palestine issued an edict banning Jews from purchasing land in 95% of Palestine. Jews now resorted to illegal immigration, Aliyah Bet or Ha'apala, often organized by the Mossad Aliyah Bet and the Irgun. With no outside help and no countries ready to admit them, very few Jews managed to escape Europe between 1939 and 1945. Those caught by the British were mostly imprisoned in Mauritius. World War II and the Holocaust. Further information: Aliyah Bet, History of the Jews during World War II, the Holocaust, an Italian bombing of Mandatory Palestine in World War II. See also, Einsatzgruppe Egypt. During the Second World War, the Jewish Agency worked to establish a Jewish army that would fight alongside the British forces. Churchill supported the plan, but British military and government opposition led to its rejection. The British demanded that the number of Jewish recruits match the number of Arab recruits. In June 1940, Italy declared war on the British Commonwealth and sided with Germany. Within a month, Italian planes bombed Tel Aviv and Haifa, inflicting multiple casualties. In May 1941, the PAL match was established to defend the Yishuv against the planned Axis invasion through North Africa. The British refusal to provide arms to the Jews, even when Rommel's forces were advancing through Egypt in June 1942, intent on occupying Palestine, and the 1939 White Paper led to the emergence of a Zionist leadership in Palestine that believed conflict with Britain was inevitable. Despite this, the Jewish Agency called on Palestine's Jewish youth to volunteer for the British Army, both men and women. 30,000 Palestinian Jews and 12,000 Palestinian Arabs enlisted in the British armed forces during the war. In June 1944, the British agreed to create a Jewish brigade that would fight in Italy. Approximately 1.5 million Jews around the world served in every branch of the Allied armies, mainly in the Soviet and US armies. 200,000 Jews died serving in the Soviet army alone. A small group, about 200 activists, dedicated to resisting the British administration in Palestine, broke away from the Etzel, which advocated support for Britain during the war, and formed the Lehi, Stern Gang, led by Avraham Stern. In 1942, the USSR released the revisionist Zionist leader Menachem Begin from the Gulag, and he went to Palestine, taking command of the Etzel organization with a policy of increased conflict against the British. At about the same time, Yitzhak Shamir escaped from the camp in Eritrea where the British were holding Lehi activists without trial, taking command of the Lehi, Stern Gang. Jews in the Middle East were also affected by the war. Most of North Africa came under Nazi control and many Jews were used as slaves. The 1941 pro-Axis coup in Iraq was accompanied by massacres of Jews. The Jewish Agency put together plans for a last stand in the event of Rommel invading Palestine. The Nazis planned to exterminate Palestine's Jews. Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazis, aided by local forces, led systematic efforts to kill every person of Jewish extraction in Europe, the Holocaust, causing the deaths of approximately 6 million Jews. A quarter of those killed were children. The Polish and German Jewish communities, which played an important role in defining the pre-1945 Jewish world, mostly ceased to exist. In the United States and Palestine, Jews of European origin became disconnected from their families and roots. As the Holocaust mainly affected Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi, and Mizrahi Jews, who had been a minority, became a much more significant factor in the Jewish world. Those Jews who survived in Central Europe were displaced persons, refugees. An Anglo-American committee of inquiry, established to examine the Palestine issue, surveyed their ambitions and found that over 95% wanted to migrate to Palestine. In the Zionist movement, the moderate pro-British and British citizen, Weizmann, whose son died flying in the RAF, was undermined by Britain's anti-Zionist policies. Leadership of the movement passed to the Jewish Agency in Palestine, now led by the anti-British Socialist Zionist Party, MAPA, led by David Ben-Gurion. Illegal Jewish immigration and insurgency. Main articles: Brisha and Jewish insurgency in Mandatory Palestine. See also, Anti-Jewish violence in Poland, 1944–46. The British Empire was severely weakened by the war. In the Middle East, the war had made Britain conscious of its dependence on Arab oil. British firms controlled Iraqi oil and Britain ruled Kuwait, Bahrain, and the Emirates. Shortly after VE Day, the Labour Party won the general election in Britain. Although Labour Party conferences had for years called for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, the Labour government now decided to maintain the 1939 White Paper policies. Illegal migration, Aliyah Bet, became the main form of Jewish entry into Palestine. Across Europe, Brisha Flight, an organization of former partisans and ghetto fighters, smuggled Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe to Mediterranean ports, where small boats tried to breach the British blockade of Palestine. Meanwhile, Jews from Arab countries began moving into Palestine overland. Despite British efforts to curb immigration, during the 14 years of the Aliyah Bet, over 110,000 Jews entered Palestine. By the end of World War II, the Jewish population of Palestine had increased to 33% of the total population. In an effort to win independence, Zionists now waged a guerrilla war against the British. The main underground Jewish militia, the Haganah, formed an alliance called the Jewish Resistance Movement with the Etzel and Stern Gang to fight the British. In June 1946, following instances of Jewish sabotage, such as in the Night of the Bridges, the British launched Operation Agatha, arresting 2,700 Jews, including the leadership of the Jewish Agency, whose headquarters were raided. Those arrested were held without trial. On July 4, 1946, a massive pogrom in Poland led to a wave of Holocaust survivors fleeing Europe for Palestine. 3 weeks later, Irgun bombed the British military headquarters of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people. In the days following the bombing, Tel Aviv was placed under curfew and over 120,000 Jews, nearly 20% of the Jewish population of Palestine, were questioned by the police. In the U.S., Congress criticized British handling of the situation and considered delaying loans that were vital to British post-war recovery. The alliance between Haganah and Etzel was dissolved after the King David bombings. Between 1945 and 1948, 100,000–120,000 Jews left Poland. Their departure was largely organized by Zionist activists in Poland under the umbrella of the semi-clandestine organization Beriha Flight. Beriha was also responsible for the organized emigration of Jews from Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, totaling 250,000, including Poland, Holocaust survivors. The British imprisoned the Jews trying to enter Palestine in the Atlat detainee camp and Cyprus internment camps. Those held were mainly Holocaust survivors, including large numbers of children and orphans. In response to Cypriot fears that the Jews would never leave, since they lacked a state or documentation, and because the 75,000 quota established by the 1939 White Paper had never been filled, the British allowed the refugees to enter Palestine at a rate of 750 per month. By 1947 the Labour government in Britain was ready to refer the Palestine problem to the newly created United Nations. United Nations Partition Plan. On April 2, 1947, the United Kingdom requested that the question of Palestine be handled by the General Assembly. The General Assembly created a committee, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, to report on the question of Palestine. In July 1947 the UNSCOP visited Palestine and met with Jewish and Zionist delegations. The Arab Higher Committee boycotted the meetings. During the visit the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin ordered that passengers from an Aliyah Bet ship, SS Exodus 1947, to be sent back to Europe. The Holocaust surviving migrants on the ship were forcibly removed by British troops at Hamburg, Germany. The principal non-Zionist Orthodox Jewish, or Herodi, Party, Agudat Israel, recommended to UNSCOP that a Jewish state be set up after reaching a religious status quo agreement with Ben-Gurion regarding the future Jewish state. The agreement granted an exemption from military service to a quota of yeshiva, religious seminary, students and to all Orthodox women, made the Sabbath the national weekend, guaranteed kosher food in government institutions and allowed Orthodox Jews to maintain a separate education system. The majority report of UNSCOP proposed an independent Arab state, an independent Jewish state, and the city of Jerusalem, the last to be under an international trusteeship system. On November 29, 1947, in Resolution 181, 2, the General Assembly adopted the majority report of UNSCOP, but with slight modifications. The plan also called for the British to allow substantial Jewish migration by February 1, 1948. Neither Britain nor the UN Security Council took any action to implement the recommendation made by the resolution, and Britain continued detaining Jews attempting to enter Palestine. Concerned that partition would severely damage Anglo-Arab relations, Britain denied UN representatives access to Palestine during the period between the adoption of Resolution 181, 2, and the termination of the British Mandate. The British withdrawal was finally completed in May 1948. However, Britain continued to hold, formerly illegal, Jewish immigrants of fighting age and their families on Cyprus until March 1949. Civil War. 1947–1948 Civil War in Mandatory Palestine. The General Assembly's vote caused joy in the Jewish community and anger in the Arab community. Violence broke out between the sides, escalating into civil war. From January 1948, operations became increasingly militarized, with the intervention of a number of Arab Liberation Army regiments inside Palestine, each active in a variety of distinct sectors around the different coastal towns. They consolidated their presence in Galilee and Samaria. Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini came from Egypt with several hundred men of the Army of the Holy War. Having recruited a few thousand volunteers, he organized the blockade of the 100,000 Jewish residents of Jerusalem. The Yishuv tried to supply the city using convoys of up to 100 armored vehicles, but largely failed. By March, almost all Haganah's armored vehicles had been destroyed, the blockade was in full operation, and hundreds of Haganah members who had tried to bring supplies into the city were killed. Up to 100,000 Arabs, from the urban upper and middle classes in Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem, or Jewish-dominated areas, evacuated abroad or to Arab centers eastwards. 289 This situation caused the U.S. to withdraw their support for the partition plan, thus encouraging the Arab League to believe that the Palestinian Arabs, reinforced by the Arab Liberation Army, could put an end to the plan for partition. The British, on the other hand, decided on February 7, 1948 to support the annexation of the Arab part of Palestine by Transjordan. The Jordanian army was commanded by the British. David Ben-Gurion reorganized the Haganah and made conscription obligatory. Every Jewish man and woman in the country had to receive military training. Thanks to funds raised by Golda Meir from sympathizers in the United States, and Stalin's decision to support the Zionist cause, the Jewish representatives of Palestine were able to purchase important arms in Eastern Europe. Ben-Gurion gave Yigael Yadin the responsibility to plan for the announced intervention of the Arab states. The result of his analysis was Plan Dalet, in which Haganah passed from the defensive to the offensive. The plan sought to establish Jewish territorial continuity by conquering mixed zones. Tiberias, Haifa, Safed, Bison, Jaffa, and Acre fell, resulting in the flight of more than 250,000 Palestinian Arabs. The situation was one of the catalysts for the intervention of neighboring Arab states. On May 14, 1948, on the day the last British forces left from Haifa, the Jewish People's Council gathered at the Tel Aviv Museum and proclaimed the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. State of Israel. Arab-Israeli War. Main article, 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Immediately following the declaration of the new state, both superpower leaders, U.S. President Harry S. Truman and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, recognized the new state. The Arab League members Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq refused to accept the UN partition plan and proclaimed the right of self-determination for the Arabs across the whole of Palestine. The Arab states marched their forces into what had, until the previous day, been the British Mandate for Palestine, starting the First Arab-Israeli War. After an initial loss of territory by the Jewish state, the tide turned in the Israelis' favor and they pushed the Arab armies back beyond the borders of the proposed Arab state. On May 29, 1948, the British initiated United Nations Security Council Resolution 50 declaring an arms embargo on the region. Czechoslovakia violated the resolution, supplying the Jewish state with critical military hardware to match the, mainly British, heavy equipment and planes already owned by the invading Arab states. On June 11, a month-long UN truce was put into effect. Following independence, the Haganah became the Israel Defense Forces, IDF. The Palmach, Etzel, and Lehi were required to cease independent operations and join the IDF. During the ceasefire, Etzel attempted to bring in a private arms shipment aboard a ship called Altalena. When they refused to hand the arms to the government, Ben-Gurion ordered that the ship be sunk. Several Etzel members were killed in the fighting. Large numbers of Jewish immigrants, many of them World War II veterans and Holocaust survivors, now began arriving in the new state of Israel, and many joined the IDF. After an initial loss of territory by the Jewish state and its occupation by the Arab armies, from July the tide gradually turned in the Israelis' favor and they pushed the Arab armies out and conquered some of the territory that had been included in the proposed Arab state. At the end of November, tenuous local ceasefires were arranged between the Israelis, Syrians, and Lebanese. On December 1, King Abdullah announced the union of Transjordan with Arab Palestine west of the Jordan. Only Britain and Pakistan recognized the annexation. Armistice Agreements. Main article, 1949 Armistice Agreements. Israel signed armistices with Egypt, February 24, Lebanon, March 23, Jordan, April 3, and Syria, July 20. No actual peace agreements were signed. With permanent ceasefire coming into effect, Israel's new borders, later known as the Green Line, were established. These borders were not recognized by the Arab states as international boundaries. Israel was in control of the Galilee, Jezreel Valley, West Jerusalem, the coastal plain and the Negev. The Syrians remained in control of a strip of territory along the Sea of Galilee originally allocated to the Jewish state, the Lebanese occupied a tiny area at Rosh Hanakra, and the Egyptians retained the Gaza Strip and still had some forces surrounded inside Israeli territory. Jordanian forces remained in the West Bank, where the British had stationed them before the war. Jordan annexed the areas it occupied while Egypt kept Gaza as an occupied zone. Following the ceasefire declaration, Britain released over 2,000 Jewish detainees it was still holding in Cyprus and recognized the State of Israel. On May 11, 1949, Israel was admitted as a member of the United Nations. Out of an Israeli population of 650,000, some 6,000 men and women were killed in the fighting, including 4,000 soldiers in the IDF, approximately 1% of the Jewish population. According to United Nations figures, 726,000 Palestinians had fled or were expelled by the Israelis between 1947 and 1949. 1948–1955, Ben-Gurion I. Sherratt. Further information, Austerity in Israel, Lavon Affair, and Reprisal Operations. See also, Provisional, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Governments of Israel. A 120-seat parliament, the Knesset, met first in Tel Aviv then moved to Jerusalem after the 1949 ceasefire. In January 1949, Israel held its first elections. The Socialist Zionist parties MAPA and MAPAM won the most seats, 46 and 19 respectively. MAPA's leader, David Ben-Gurion, was appointed prime minister. He formed a coalition which did not include MAPAM, who were Stalinist and loyal to the USSR. Another Stalinist party, non-Zionist Maki, won 4 seats. This was a significant decision, as it signaled that Israel would not be in the Soviet bloc. The Knesset elected Chaim Weizmann as the first, largely ceremonial, president of Israel. Hebrew and Arabic were made the official languages of the new state. All governments have been coalitions. No party has ever won a majority in the Knesset. From 1948 until 1977 all governments were led by MAPA and the Alignment, predecessors of the Labour Party. In those years Labour Zionists, initially led by David Ben-Gurion, dominated Israeli politics and the economy was run on primarily socialist lines. Within 3 years, 1948 to 1951, immigration doubled the Jewish population of Israel and left an indelible imprint on Israeli society. Overall, 700,000 Jews settled in Israel during this period. Some 300,000 arrived from Asian and North African nations as part of the Jewish exodus from Arab and Muslim countries. Among them, the largest group, over 100,000, was from Iraq. The rest of the immigrants were from Europe, including more than 270,000 who came from Eastern Europe, mainly Romania and Poland, over 100,000 each. Nearly all the Jewish immigrants could be described as refugees, however only 136,000 who immigrated to Israel from Central Europe had international certification because they belonged to the 250,000 Jews registered by the Allies as displaced after World War II and living in displaced persons camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. In 1950 the Knesset passed the Law of Return, which granted to all Jews and those of Jewish ancestry, Jewish grandparent, and their spouses, the right to settle in Israel and gain citizenship. That year, 50,000 Yemenite Jews, 99%, were secretly flown to Israel in Operation Magic Carpet. In 1951 Iraqi Jews were granted temporary permission to leave the country and 120,000, over 90%, opted to move to Israel as part of Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. Jews also fled from Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. By the late 60s, about 500,000 Jews had left Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Over the course of 20 years, some 850,000 Jews from Arab countries, 99%, relocated to Israel, 680,000, France and the Americas. The land and property left behind by the Jews, much of it in Arab city centers, is still a matter of some dispute. Today there are about 9,000 Jews living in Arab states, of whom 75% live in Morocco and 15% in Tunisia. Vast assets, approximately $150 billion worth of goods and property, before inflation, were left behind in these countries. Between 1948 and 1958, the population of Israel rose from 800,000 to 2 million. During this period, food, clothes, and furniture had to be rationed in what became known as the austerity period, Tikufat Hatzna. Immigrants were mostly refugees with no money or possessions, and many were housed in temporary camps known as ma'abarot. By 1952, over 200,000 immigrants were living in tents or prefabricated shacks built by the government. Israel received financial aid from private donations from outside the country, mainly the United States. The pressure on the new state's finances led Ben-Gurion to sign a controversial reparations agreement with West Germany. During the Knesset debate, some 5,000 demonstrators gathered and riot police had to cordon the building. Israel received several billion marks and in return agreed to open diplomatic relations with Germany. In 1949, education was made free and compulsory for all citizens until the age of 14. The state now funded the party-affiliated Zionist education system and a new body created by the Herodian Israel Party. A separate body was created to provide education for the remaining Palestinian Arab population. The major political parties now competed for immigrants to join their education systems. The government banned the existing educational bodies from the transit camps and tried to mandate a unitary secular socialist education 320 under the control of camp managers who also had to provide work, food, and housing for the immigrants. There were attempts to force Orthodox Yemenite children to adopt a secular lifestyle by teachers, including many instances of Yemenite children having their side curls cut by teachers. The Yemenite children affair led to the first Israeli public inquiry, the Fromkin Inquiry, the collapse of the coalition, and an election in 1951. In its early years, Israel sought to maintain a non-aligned position between the superpowers. However, in 1952, an anti-Semitic public trial was staged in Moscow in which a group of Jewish doctors were accused of trying to poison Stalin, the doctors' plot, followed by a similar trial in Czechoslovakia, Slansky trial. This, and the failure of Israel to be included in the Bandung Conference of 1955, of non-aligned states, effectively ended Israel's pursuit of non-alignment. On May 19, 1950, in contravention of international law, Egypt announced that the Suez Canal was closed to Israeli ships and commerce. In 1952, a military coup in Egypt brought Abdel Nasser to power. The United States pursued close relations with the new Arab states, particularly the Nasser-led Egyptian Free Officers Movement and Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. Israel's solution to diplomatic isolation was to establish good relations with newly independent states in Africa and with France, which was engaged in the Algerian War. In the January 1955 elections, MAPE won 40 seats and the Labour Party 10. Moshe Sharett became Prime Minister of Israel at the head of a left-wing coalition. Between 1953 and 1956, there were intermittent clashes along all of Israel's borders as Arab terrorism and breaches of the ceasefire resulting in Israeli counter-raids. Palestinian Fedayeen attacks, often organized and sponsored by the Egyptians, were made from Egyptian occupied Gaza. Fedayeen attacks led to a growing cycle of violence as Israel launched reprisal attacks against Gaza. In 1954, the Uzi submachine gun first entered use by the Israel Defense Forces. In 1955, the Egyptian government began recruiting former Nazi rocket scientists for a missile program. Sharett's government was brought down by the Lavon Affair, a crude plan to disrupt U.S.-Egyptian relations, involving Israeli agents planting bombs at American sites in Egypt. The plan failed when 11 agents were arrested. Defense Minister Lavon was blamed despite his denial of responsibility. The Lavon affair led to Sharett's resignation and Ben-Gurion returned to the post of Prime Minister. 1955–1963, Ben-Gurion II. Further information, Suez Crisis. See also, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th Governments of Israel. In 1955, Egypt concluded a massive arms deal with Czechoslovakia, upsetting the balance of power in the Middle East. In 1956, the increasingly pro-Soviet President Nasser of Egypt announced the nationalization of the French and British-owned Suez Canal, which was Egypt's main source of foreign currency. Egypt also blockaded the Gulf of Aqaba, preventing Israeli access to the Red Sea. Israel made a secret agreement with the French at Sèvres to coordinate military operations against Egypt. Britain and France had already begun secret preparations for military action. It has been alleged that the French also agreed to build a nuclear plant for the Israelis and that by 1968 this was able to produce nuclear weapons. Britain and France arranged for Israel to give them a pretext for seizing the Suez Canal. Israel was to attack Egypt, and Britain and France would then call on both sides to withdraw. When, as expected, the Egyptians refused, Anglo-French forces would invade to take control of the canal. Israeli forces, commanded by General Moshe Dayan, launched Operation Kadesh against Egypt on October 29, 1956. On October 30, Britain and France made their pre-arranged call for both sides to stop fighting and withdraw from the canal area, and for them to be allowed to take up positions at key points on the canal. Egypt refused and the Allies commenced airstrikes on October 31 aimed at neutralizing the Egyptian Air Force. By November 5 the Israelis had overrun the Sinai. The Anglo-French invasion began that day. There was uproar in the UN, with the United States and USSR for once in agreement in denouncing the actions of Israel, Britain, and France. A demand for a ceasefire was reluctantly accepted on November 7. At Egypt's request, the UN sent an emergency force, UNEF, consisting of 6,000 peacekeeping troops from 10 nations to supervise the ceasefire. This was the first ever UN peacekeeping operation. From 15 November the Union troops marked out a zone across the Sinai to separate the Israeli and Egyptian forces. Upon receiving U.S. guarantees of Israeli access to the Suez Canal, freedom of access out of the Gulf of Aqaba and Egyptian action to stop Palestinian raids from Gaza, the Israelis withdrew to the Negev. In practice the Suez Canal remained closed to Israeli shipping. The conflict marked the end of West European dominance in the Middle East. Nasser emerged as the victor in the conflict, having won the political battle. In 1956, two modern Orthodox and religious Zionist parties, Mizrachi and Hapoel HaMizrachi, joined to form the National Religious Party. The party was a component of every Israeli coalition until 1992, usually running the Ministry of Education. Mapei was once again victorious in the 1959 elections, increasing its number of seats to 47, Labour had 7. Ben-Gurion remained Prime Minister. Rudolf Kastner, a minor political functionary, was accused of collaborating with the Nazis and sued his accuser. Kastner lost the trial and was assassinated 2 years later. In 1958, the Supreme Court exonerated him. In May 1960, Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief administrators of the Nazi Holocaust, was located in Argentina by the Mossad, later kidnapping him and bringing him to Israel. In 1961 he was put on trial, and after several months found guilty and sentenced to death. He was hanged in 1962 and is the only person ever sentenced to death by an Israeli court. Testimonies by Holocaust survivors at the trial and the extensive publicity that surrounded it has led the trial to be considered a turning point in public awareness of the Holocaust. In 1961 a Herod no-confidence motion over the resurfaced Lavon affair led to Ben-Gurion's resignation. Ben-Gurion declared that he would only accept office if Lavon was fired from the position of the head of Histadrut, Israel's labor union organization. His demands were accepted and Mapei won the 1961 election, 42 seats keeping Ben-Gurion as PM, with a slight reduction in its share of the seats. Menachem Begin's Herod Party and the Liberals came next with 17 seats each. In 1962 the Mossad began assassinating German rocket scientists working in Egypt in Operation Damocles after one of them reported the missile program was designed to carry chemical warheads. This action was condemned by Ben-Gurion and led to the Mossad director, Isser Harel, resignation. In 1963 Ben-Gurion quit again over the Lavon affair. His attempts to make his party Mapei support him over the issue failed. Levi Eshkol became leader of Mapei and the new prime minister. 1963–1969, Eshkol. Further information, Six-Day War. See also, 11th, 12th, and 13th Governments of Israel. In 1963 Ugail Yadin began excavating Masada. In 1964, Egypt, Jordan and Syria developed a unified military command. Israel completed work on a national water carrier, a huge engineering project designed to transfer Israel's allocation of the Jordan River's waters towards the south of the country in realization of Ben-Gurion's dream of mass Jewish settlement of the Negev desert. The Arabs responded by trying to divert the headwaters of the Jordan, leading to growing conflict between Israel and Syria. Ben-Gurion quit Mapei to form the new party Rafi. He was joined by Shimon Peres and Moshe Dayan. Begin's Herut party joined with the liberals to form Gehil. Mapei and Labour united for the 1965 elections, winning 45 seats and maintaining Levi Eshkol as prime minister. Ben-Gurion's Rafi party received 10 seats, Gehil got 26 seats, becoming the second largest party. Until 1966, Israel's principal arms supplier was France. However, in 1966, following the withdrawal from Algeria, Charles de Gaulle announced France would cease supplying Israel with arms, and refused to refund money paid for 50 warplanes. On February 5, 1966, the United States announced that it was taking over the former French and West German obligations, to maintain military stabilization in the Middle East. Included in the military hardware would be over 200 M48 tanks. In May of that year, the U.S. also agreed to provide A-4 Skyhawk tactical aircraft to Israel. In 1966, security restrictions placed on Arab Israelis were eased and efforts made to integrate them into Israeli life. In 1966, black and white TV broadcasts began. On May 15, 1967, the first public performance of Naomi Shemer's classic song Jerusalem of Gold took place, and over the next few weeks it dominated the Israeli airwaves. 2 days later, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan amassed troops along the Israeli borders, and Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Nasser demanded that the UNEF leave Sinai, threatening escalation to a full war. Egyptian radio broadcasts talked of a coming genocide. On May 26, Nasser declared, "The battle will be a general one and our basic objective will be to destroy Israel." Israel considered the Straits of Tiran closure a casus belli. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq signed defense pacts, and Iraqi troops began deploying to Jordan, Syria and Egypt. Algeria also announced that it would send troops to Egypt. Between 1963 and 1967, Egyptian troops had tested chemical weapons on Yemenite civilians as part of an Egyptian intervention in support of rebels. On the morning before Dayan was sworn in, June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched Operation Focus, a series of preemptive attacks in which it preemptively attacked the Egyptian Air Force, kicking off the Six-Day War, and then, later the same day, struck the air forces of Jordan and Syria. By June 11 the Arab forces were routed and all parties had accepted the ceasefire called for by UN Security Council Resolutions 235 and 236. Israel gained control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the formerly Jordanian-controlled West Bank of the Jordan River. East Jerusalem was annexed by Israel. The result of the August 29, 1967 Arab League summit was the Khartoum Resolution, which according to Abd al-Azim Ramadan, left only one option: a war with Israel. In 1968 Moshe Levinger led a group of religious Zionists who created the first Jewish settlement, a town near Hebron called Kiryat Arba. There were no other religious settlements until after 1974. Ben-Gurion's Rafi party merged with the Labour-Mapei alliance. Ben-Gurion remained outside as an independent. In 1968, compulsory education was extended until the age of 16 for all citizens. It had been 14, and the government embarked on an extensive program of integration in education. In the major cities, children from mainly Sephardi/Mizrahi neighborhoods were bused to newly established middle schools in better areas. The system remained in place until after 2000. In March 1968, Israeli forces attacked the Palestinian militia, Fatah, at its base in the Jordanian town of Karamat. The attack was in response to landmines placed on Israeli roads. The Israelis retreated after destroying the camp. However, the Israelis sustained unexpectedly high casualties and the attack was not viewed as a success. Despite heavy casualties, the Palestinians claimed victory, while Fatah and the PLO, of which it formed part, became famous across the Arab world. In early 1969, fighting broke out between Egypt and Israel along the Suez Canal. In retaliation for repeated Egyptian shelling of Israeli positions along the Suez Canal, Israeli planes made deep strikes into Egypt in the 1969–1970 War of Attrition. 1969–1974, Meir. Further information: War of Attrition, Jarring Mission, Rogers Plan, Munich Massacre, and Yom Kippur War. See also, 14th, 15th, and 16th Governments of Israel. In early 1969, Levi Eshkol died in office of a heart attack and Golda Meir became prime minister with the largest percentage of the vote ever won by an Israeli party, winning 56 of the 120 seats after the 1969 election. Meir was the first female prime minister of Israel and the first woman to have headed a Middle Eastern state in modern times. Gehil retained its 26 seats, and was the second largest party. In September 1970, King Hussein of Jordan drove the Palestine Liberation Organization out of his country. On September 18, 1970, Syrian tanks invaded Jordan, intending to aid the PLO. At the request of the US, Israel moved troops to the border and threatened Syria, causing the Syrians to withdraw. The center of PLO activity then shifted to Lebanon, where the 1969 Cairo Agreement gave the Palestinians autonomy within the south of the country. The area controlled by the PLO became known by the international press and locals as Fatahland and contributed to the 1975–1990 Lebanese Civil War. The event also led to Hafez al-Assad taking power in Syria. Egyptian President Nasser died of a heart attack immediately after and was succeeded by Anwar Sadat. Increased Soviet anti-Semitism and enthusiasm generated by the 1967 victory led to a wave of Soviet Jews applying to emigrate to Israel. Most Jews were refused exit visas and persecuted by the authorities. Some were arrested, becoming known as prisoners of Zion. During 1971, violent demonstrations by the Israeli Black Panthers made the Israeli public aware of resentment among Mizrahi Jews at ongoing discrimination and social gaps. In 1972, the U.S. Jewish mafia leader, Meir Lansky, who had taken refuge in Israel, was deported to the United States. At the 1972 Munich Olympics, 2 members of the Israeli team were killed, and 9 members taken hostage by Palestinian terrorists. A botched German rescue attempt led to the death of the rest along with 5 of the 8 hijackers. The 3 surviving Palestinians were released by the West German authorities 8 weeks later without charge, in exchange for the hostages of hijacked Lufthansa Flight 615. 351 The Israeli government responded with an air raid, a raid on the PLO headquarters in Lebanon, led by future Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and an assassination campaign against the organizers of the massacre. In 1972 the new Egyptian President Anwar Sadat expelled the Soviet advisors from Egypt. This infrequent invasion exercises by Egypt and Syria led to Israeli complacency about the threat from these countries. In addition, the desire not to be held responsible for initiating conflict and an election campaign highlighting security, led to an Israeli failure to mobilize, despite receiving warnings of an impending attack. The Yom Kippur War, also known as the October War, began on October 6, 1973, with the Syrian and Egyptian armies launching a surprise attack against the unprepared Israeli Defense Forces. Both the Soviets and the Americans, at the orders of Henry Kissinger, rushed arms to their allies in Operation Nickel Grass. The Syrians were repulsed at the Valley of Tears on the Golan End, while the Egyptians captured a strip of territory in Sinai, but were outflanked by Israeli forces over the Suez Canal in the Battle of Ismailia, which trapped the Egyptian Third Army in Sinai. On January 18, 1974, U.S. diplomatic efforts led to a disengagement of forces agreement with the Egyptian government and on May 31 with the Syrian government. The war was the catalyst for the 1973 oil crisis, a Saudi-led oil embargo in conjunction with OPEC against countries trading with Israel. Severe shortages led to massive increases in the price of oil, and as a result, many countries broke off relations with Israel or downgraded relations, and Israel was banned from participation in the Asian Games and other Asian sporting events. Prior to the December 1973 elections, Gehel and a number of right-wing parties united to form the Likud, led by Begin. In the December 1973 elections, Labour won 51 seats, leaving Golda Meir as Prime Minister. The Likud won 39 seats. In May 1974, Palestinians attacked a school in Ma'alat, holding 102 children hostage. 22 children were killed. In November 1974 the PLO was granted observer status at the UN and Yasser Arafat addressed the General Assembly. Later that year, the Granite Commission, appointed to assess responsibility for Israel's lack of preparedness for the war, exonerated the government of responsibility, and held the Chief of Staff and Head of Military Intelligence responsible. Despite the report, public anger at the government led to Golda Meir's resignation. 1974–1977, Rabin I. See also, 17th Government of Israel. Following Meir's resignation, Yitzhak Rabin became Prime Minister. Religious Zionist followers of the teachings of Abraham Isaac Kook formed the Gush Emunah movement, and began an organized drive to settle the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In November 1975, the United Nations General Assembly, under the guidance of Austrian Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim, adopted Resolution 3379, which asserted Zionism to be a form of racism. The General Assembly rescinded this resolution in December 1991 with Resolution 4686. In March 1976, there was a massive strike by Israeli Arabs in protest at a government plan to expropriate land in the Galilee. In July 1976, Rabin ordered Operation Entebbe to rescue kidnapped Jewish passengers from an Air France flight hijacked by PFLP militants and German revolutionaries and flown to Uganda. 356 Better source needed. In January 1977, French authorities arrested Abu Daoud, the planner of the Munich massacre, releasing him a few days later. In March 1977, Anatoly Sharansky, a prominent refusnik and spokesman for the Moscow-Helsinki Group, was sentenced to 13 years hard labor. Rabin resigned in April 1977 after it emerged that his wife maintained a dollar account in the United States, illegal at the time, which had been opened while Rabin was Israeli ambassador. The incident became known as the dollar account affair. Shimon Peres informally replaced him as prime minister, leading the alignment in the subsequent elections. 1977–1983, begin. Further information, Camp David Accords, 1978 South Lebanon conflict, and 1982 Lebanon War. See also, 18th and 19th Governments of Israel. In a surprise result, the Likud led by Menachem Begin won 43 seats in the 1977 elections. This was the first time in Israeli history that the government was not led by the left. In November 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat visited Jerusalem and spoke at the Knesset at the invitation of Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Sadat recognized Israel's right to exist and established the basis for direct negotiations between Egypt and Israel. Following Sadat's visit, 350 Yom Kippur War veterans organized the Peace Now movement to encourage Israeli governments to make peace with the Arabs. In March 1978, 11 armed Lebanese Palestinians reached Israel in boats and carried out the Coastal Road massacre in opposition to the Egyptian-Israeli peace process. 3 days later, Israeli forces crossed into Lebanon beginning Operation Litany. After passage of United Nations Security Council Resolution 425, calling for Israeli withdrawal and the creation of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, peacekeeping force, Israel withdrew its troops. In September 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter invited President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin to meet with him at Camp David, and on September 11 they agreed on a framework for peace between Israel and Egypt, and a comprehensive peace in the Middle East. It set out broad principles to guide negotiations between Israel and the Arab states. It also established guidelines for a West Bank Gaza transitional regime of full autonomy for the Palestinians residing in these territories, and for a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. The treaty was signed March 26, 1979 by Begin and Sadat, with President Carter signing as witness. Under the treaty, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in April 1982. The Arab League reacted to the peace treaty by suspending Egypt from the organization and moving its headquarters from Cairo to Tunis. Sadat was assassinated in 1981 by Islamic fundamentalist members of the Egyptian army who opposed peace with Israel. Following the agreement, Israel and Egypt became the two largest recipients of U.S. military and financial aid. 361. Iraq and Afghanistan have now overtaken them. In December 1978, the Israeli Merkava battle tank entered use with the IDF. In 1979, over 40,000 Iranian Jews migrated to Israel, escaping the Islamic Revolution there. On June 30, 1981, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the Iraq nuclear reactor in Operation Opera that France was building for Iraq. 3 weeks later, Begin won again, in the 1981 elections, 48 seats Likud, 47 Labour. Ariel Sharon was made defense minister. The new government annexed the Golan Heights and banned the national airline from flying on Shabbat. By the 1980s, a diverse set of high-tech industries had developed in Israel. In the decades following the 1948 war, Israel's border with Lebanon was quiet compared to its borders with other neighbors. But the 1969 Cairo Agreement gave the PLO a free hand to attack Israel from South Lebanon. The area was governed by the PLO independently of the Lebanese government and became known as Fatah Land. Fatah was the largest faction in the PLO. Palestinian irregulars constantly shelled the Israeli north, especially the town of Kiryat Shmona, which was a Likud stronghold inhabited primarily by Jews who had fled the Arab world. Lack of control over Palestinian areas was an important factor in causing civil war in Lebanon. In June 1982, the attempted assassination of Shlomo Argov, the ambassador to Britain, was used as a pretext for an Israeli invasion aiming to drive the PLO out of the southern half of Lebanon. Sharon agreed with Chief of Staff Raphael Eitan to expand the invasion deep into Lebanon even though the cabinet had only authorized a 40-kilometer deep invasion. The invasion became known as the 1982 Lebanon War, and the Israeli army occupied Beirut, the only time an Arab capital has been occupied by Israel. Some of the Shia and Christian population of South Lebanon welcomed the Israelis, as PLO forces had maltreated them, but Lebanese resentment of Israeli occupation grew over time and the Shia became gradually radicalized under Iranian guidance. Constant casualties among Israeli soldiers and Lebanese civilians led to growing opposition to the war in Israel. In August 1982, the PLO withdrew its forces from Lebanon, moving to Tunisia. Bashir Gemayel was elected president of Lebanon, and reportedly agreed to recognize Israel and sign a peace treaty. However, Gemayel was assassinated before an agreement could be signed, and one day later Falangist Christian forces led by Eli Hobika entered 2 Palestinian refugee camps and massacred the occupants. The massacres led to the biggest demonstration ever in Israel against the war, with as many as 400,000 people, almost 10% of the population, gathering in Tel Aviv. In 1983, an Israeli public inquiry found that Israel's defense minister, Sharon, was indirectly but personally responsible for the massacres. It also recommended that he never again be allowed to hold the post. It did not forbid him from being prime minister. In 1983, the May 17 agreement was signed between Israel and Lebanon, paving the way for an Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory through a few stages. Israel continued to operate against the PLO until its eventual departure in 1985, and kept a small force stationed in southern Lebanon in support of the South Lebanon Army until May 2000. 1983–1992, Shamir I, Paris I, Shamir II. In September 1983, Begin resigned and was succeeded by Yitzhak Shamir as Prime Minister. The 1984 election was inconclusive, and led to a power-sharing agreement between Shimon Peres of the Alignment and Shamir of Likud. Peres was Prime Minister from 1984 to 1986 and Shamir from 1986 to 1988. In 1984, continual discrimination against Sephardi ultra-Orthodox Jews by the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox establishment led political activist Aryeh Deri to leave the Agudat Israel Party and join former Chief Rabbi Avadia Yosef in forming Shas, a new party aimed at the non-Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox vote. In June 1985, Israel withdrew most of its troops from Lebanon, leaving a residual Israeli force and an Israeli-supported militia in southern Lebanon as a security zone and buffer against attacks on its northern territory. Since then, the IDF fought for many years against the Shia organization Hezbollah, which became a growing threat to Israel. By July 1985, Israel's inflation, buttressed by complex index linking of salaries, had reached 480% per annum and was the highest in the world. Paris introduced emergency control of prices and cut government expenditure, successfully bringing inflation under control. The currency, known as the Old Israeli shekel, was replaced and renamed the Israeli new shekel at a rate of 1,000 old shekalim equals 1 new shekel. Growing Israeli settlement and continuing occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip led to the First Intifada in 1987, which lasted until the Oslo Accords of 1993, despite Israeli attempts to suppress it. Human rights abuses by Israeli troops led a group of Israelis to form B'Tselem, an organization devoted to improving awareness and compliance with human rights requirements in Israel. The alignment and Likud remained neck and neck in the 1988 elections. Shamir successfully formed a national unity coalition with the labor alignment. In March 1990, alignment leader Shimon Peres engineered a defeat of the government in a non-confidence vote and then tried to form a new government. The attempt, which became known as the Dirty Trick, failed and Shamir became prime minister at the head of a right-wing coalition. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War between Iraq and a large Allied force, led by the United States. Iraq attacked Israel with 39 Scud missiles. Israel did not retaliate at request of the US, fearing that if Israel responded against Iraq, other Arab nations might desert the Allied coalition. The coalition's victory in the Gulf War opened new possibilities for regional peace, and in October 1991 the U.S. President, George H.W. Bush, and Soviet Union Premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, jointly convened a historic meeting in Madrid of Israeli, Lebanese, Jordanian, Syrian, and Palestinian leaders. Shamir opposed the idea but agreed in return for loan guarantees to help with absorption of immigrants from the former Soviet Union. His participation in the conference led to the collapse of his right-wing coalition. 1992–1996, Rabin II, Paris II. Further information: Oslo Accords and assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. See also, 25th and 26th Governments of Israel. In the 1992 elections, the Labour Party, led by Yitzhak Rabin, won a significant victory, 44 seats, promising to pursue peace while promoting Rabin as a tough general and pledging not to deal with the PLO in any way. The Left Zionist Party Meretz won 12 seats, and the Arab and Communist parties a further 5, meaning that parties supporting a peace treaty had a full, albeit small, majority in the Knesset. On July 25, 1993, Israel carried out a week-long military operation in Lebanon to attack Hezbollah positions dubbed Operation Accountability. On September 13, 1993, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, signed the Oslo Accords, a declaration of principles, on the South Lawn of the White House. The principles established objectives relating to a transfer of authority from Israel to an interim Palestinian Authority, as a prelude to a final treaty establishing a Palestinian state, in exchange for mutual recognition. The DOP established May 1999 as the date by which a permanent status agreement for the West Bank and Gaza Strip would take effect. In February 1994, Barak Goldstein, a follower of the Catch Party, killed 29 Palestinians and wounded 125 at the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, which became known as the Cave of the Patriarchs Massacre. Catch had been barred from participation in the 1992 elections, on the grounds that the movement was racist. It was subsequently made illegal. Israel and the PLO signed the Gaza-Jericho Agreement in May 1994, and the Agreement on Preparatory Transfer of Powers and Responsibilities in August, which began the process of transferring authority from Israel to the Palestinians. On July 25, 1994, Jordan and Israel signed the Washington Declaration, which formally ended the state of war that had existed between them since 1948, and on October 26 the Israel-Jordan Treaty of Peace, witnessed by U.S. President Bill Clinton. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat signed the Israeli-Palestinian Interim Agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip on September 28, 1995 in Washington. The agreement was witnessed by President Bill Clinton on behalf of the United States and by Russia, Egypt, Norway, and the European Union, and incorporates and supersedes the previous agreements, marking the conclusion of the first stage of negotiations between Israel and the PLO. The agreement allowed the PLO leadership to relocate to the occupied territories and granted autonomy to the Palestinians, with talks to follow regarding final status. In return, the Palestinians promised to abstain from use of terror and changed the Palestinian National Covenant, which had called for the expulsion of all Jews who migrated after 1917 and the elimination of Israel. The agreement was opposed by Hamas and other Palestinian factions, which launched suicide bomber attacks at Israel. Rabin had a barrier constructed around Gaza to prevent attacks. The growing separation between Israel and the Palestinian territories led to a labor shortage in Israel, mainly in the construction industry. Israeli firms began importing laborers from the Philippines, Thailand, China, and Romania. Some of these laborers stayed on without visas. In addition, a growing number of Africans began illegally migrating to Israel. On November 4, 1995, a far-right-wing religious Zionist opponent of the Oslo Accords assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. In February 1996, Rabin's successor, Shimon Peres, called early elections. In April 1996, Israel launched Operation Grapes of Wrath in southern Lebanon as a result of Hezbollah's Katyusha rocket attacks on Israeli population centers along the border. 1996–2001, Netanyahu I. Barak. Further information, 2000 Camp David Summit. See also, 27th and 28th Governments of Israel. The May 1996 elections were the first featuring direct election of the Prime Minister and resulted in a narrow election victory for Likud leader Benjamin Netanyahu. A spate of suicide bombings reinforced the Likud position for security. Hamas claimed responsibility for most of the bombings. Despite his stated differences with the Oslo Accords, Prime Minister Netanyahu continued their implementation, but his prime ministership saw a marked slowdown in the peace process. Netanyahu also pledged to gradually reduce U.S. aid to Israel. Better source needed. In September 1996, a Palestinian riot broke out against the creation of an exit in the Western Wall tunnel. Over the subsequent few weeks, around 80 people were killed as a result. In January 1997, Netanyahu signed the Hebron Protocol with the Palestinian Authority, resulting in the redeployment of Israeli forces in Hebron and the turnover of civilian authority in much of the area to the Palestinian Authority. In the election of July 1999, Ehud Barak of the Labour Party became Prime Minister. His party was the largest in the Knesset with 26 seats. In September 1999, the Supreme Court of Israel ruled that the use of torture in interrogation of Palestinian prisoners was illegal. On March 21, 2000, Pope John Paul II arrived in Israel for an historic visit. On May 25, 2000, Israel unilaterally withdrew its remaining forces from the security zone in southern Lebanon. Several thousand members of the South Lebanon Army, and their families, left with the Israelis. The UN Secretary-General concluded 375 that, as of June 16, 2000, Israel had withdrawn its forces from Lebanon in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 425. Lebanon claims that Israel continues to occupy Lebanese territory called Sheba A Farms, however this area was governed by Syria until 1967 when Israel took control. 376 The Sheba A Farms provided Hezbollah with a pretext to maintain warfare with Israel. The Lebanese government, in contravention of the UN Security Council resolution, did not assert sovereignty in the area, which came under Hezbollah control. In the fall of 2000, talks were held at Camp David to reach a final agreement on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Ehud Barak offered to meet most of the Palestinian team's requests for territory and political concessions, including Arab parts of East Jerusalem. However, Arafat abandoned the talks without making a counter-proposal. Following its withdrawal from South Lebanon, Israel became a member of the Western European and Others group at the United Nations. Prior to this, Israel was the only nation at the UN which was not a member of any group. The Arab states would not allow it to join the Asia group, which meant it could not be a member of the Security Council or appoint anyone to the International Court and other key UN roles. Since December 2013 it has been a permanent member of the group. Since December 2013 it has been a permanent member of the group. On September 28, 2000, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Al-Aqsa compound, or Temple Mount. The following day the Palestinians launched the Al-Aqsa Intifada. David Samuels and Khaled Abu Tomet have stated that the uprising was planned much earlier. In 2001, with the peace process increasingly in disarray, Ehud Barak called a special election for Prime Minister. Barak hoped a victory would give him renewed authority in negotiations with the Palestinians. Instead, opposition leader Ariel Sharon was elected PM. After this election, the system of directly electing the premier was abandoned. 2001–2006, Sharon. The failure of the peace process, increased Palestinian terror and occasional attacks by Hezbollah from Lebanon, led much of the Israeli public and political leadership to lose confidence in the Palestinian Authority as a peace partner. Most felt that many Palestinians viewed the peace treaty with Israel as a temporary measure only. Many Israelis were thus anxious to disengage from the Palestinians. In response to a wave of suicide bomb attacks, culminating in the Passover massacre, see list of Israeli civilian casualties in the Second Intifada, Israel launched Operation Defensive Shield in March 2002, and Sharon began the construction of a barrier around the West Bank. Around the same time, the Israeli town of Sderot and other Israeli communities near Gaza became subject to constant shelling and mortar bomb attacks from Gaza. Thousands of Jews from Latin America began arriving in Israel due to economic crises in their countries of origin. In January 2003, separate elections were held for the Knesset. Likud won the most seats, 27. An anti-religion party, Shinui, led by media pundit Tommy Lapid, won 15 seats on a secularist platform, making it the third largest party, ahead of Orthodox Shas. Internal fighting led to Shinui's demise at the next election. In 2004, the Black Hebrews were granted permanent residency in Israel. The group had begun migrating to Israel 25 years earlier from the United States, but had not been recognized as Jews by the state and hence not granted citizenship under Israel's law of return. They had settled in Israel without official status. From 2004 onwards, they received citizens' rights. In 2005, all Jewish settlers were evacuated from Gaza, some forcibly, and their homes demolished. Disengagement from the Gaza Strip was completed on September 12, 2005. Military disengagement from the northern West Bank was completed 10 days later. In 2005, Sharon left the Likud and formed a new party called Kadima, which accepted that the peace process would lead to creation of a Palestinian state. He was joined by many leading figures from both Likud and Labor. Hamas won the 2006 Palestinian legislative election, the first and only genuinely free Palestinian elections. Hamas leaders rejected all agreements signed with Israel, refused to recognize Israel's right to exist, refused to abandon terror, and occasionally claimed the Holocaust was a Jewish conspiracy. The withdrawal and Hamas victory left the status of Gaza unclear, as Israel asserted it was no longer an occupying power but continued to control air and sea access to Gaza, although it did not exercise sovereignty on the ground. Egypt insisted that it was still occupied and refused to open border crossings with Gaza, although it was free to do so. In April 2006, Ariel Sharon was incapacitated by a severe hemorrhagic stroke and Ehud Olmert became Prime Minister. 2006–2009, Olmert. Further information, Startup Nation, 2006 Hamas cross-border raid, 2006 Lebanon War, and Gaza War, 2008–09. See also, 31st Government of Israel. Ehud Olmert was elected Prime Minister after his party, Kadima, won the most seats, 29, in the 2006 Israeli legislative election. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was officially elected President of Iran. Since then, Iranian policy towards Israel has grown more confrontational. On March 14, 2006, Israel carried out Operation Bringing Home the Goods in the Palestinian Authority prison of Jericho in order to capture Ahmed Saadat and several Palestinian Arab prisoners located there who assassinated Israeli politician Rehavam Ze'evi in 2001. The operation was conducted as a result of the expressed intentions of the newly elected Hamas government to release these prisoners. On June 25, 2006, a Hamas force crossed the border from Gaza and attacked a tank, capturing Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, sparking clashes in Gaza. On July 12, Hezbollah attacked Israel from Lebanon, shelled Israeli towns and attacked a border patrol, taking 2 dead or badly wounded Israeli soldiers. These incidents led Israel to initiate the Second Lebanon War, which lasted through August 2006. Israeli forces entered some villages in southern Lebanon, while the Air Force attacked targets all across the country. Israel only made limited ground gains until the launch of Operation Changing Direction 11, which lasted for 3 days with disputed results. Shortly before a UN ceasefire came into effect, Israeli troops captured Wadi Saluki. The war concluded with Hezbollah evacuating its forces from southern Lebanon, while the IDF remained until its positions could be handed over to the Lebanese Armed Forces and UNIFIL. In June 2007, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip in the course of the Battle of Gaza, seizing government institutions and replacing Fatah and other government officials with its own. Following the takeover, Egypt and Israel imposed a partial blockade, on the grounds that Fatah had fled and was no longer providing security on the Palestinian side, and to prevent arms smuggling by terrorist groups. On September 6, 2007, the Israeli Air Force destroyed a nuclear reactor in Syria in Operation Orchard. On February 28, 2008, Israel launched Operation Hot Winter in Gaza in response to the constant firing of Qassam rockets by Hamas militants. On July 16, 2008, Hezbollah swapped the bodies of Israeli soldiers Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev, kidnapped in 2006, in exchange for the Lebanese terrorist Samir Kuntar, 4 Hezbollah prisoners, and the bodies of 199 Palestinian Arab and Lebanese fighters. Olmert came under investigation for corruption, and this led him to announce on July 30, 2008, that he would be stepping down as Prime Minister following election of a new leader of the Kadima party in September 2008. Tzipi Livni won the election, but was unable to form a coalition, and Olmert remained in office until the general election. Israel carried out Operation Cast Lead in the Gaza Strip from December 27, 2008 to January 18, 2009 in response to rocket attacks from Hamas militants, leading to a decrease of Palestinian rocket attacks. 392 better source needed. 2009-2021, Netanyahu 2. Further information, 2011 Israeli social justice protests, Tamar gas field, Operation Pillar of Defense, 2014 Gaza War, and 2021 Israel-Palestine crisis. See also, 32nd, 33rd, 34th, and 35th governments of Israel. In the 2009 legislative election, Likud won 27 seats and Kadima 28, however, the right-wing camp won a majority of seats, and President Shimon Peres called on Netanyahu to form the government. Russian immigrant-dominated Yisrael Beiteinu came third with 15 seats, and Labour was reduced to fourth place with 13 seats. In 2009, Israeli billionaire Yitzhak Shuvah announced the discovery of huge natural gas reserves off the coast of Israel. On May 31, 2010, an international incident broke out in the Mediterranean Sea when foreign activists trying to break the maritime blockade over Gaza clashed with Israeli troops. During the struggle, 9 Turkish activists were killed. In late September 2010 took place direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians without success. As a defensive countermeasure to the rocket threat against Israel's civilian population, at the end of March 2011 Israel began to operate the Advanced Mobile Air Defense System Iron Dome in the southern region of Israel and along the border with the Gaza Strip. On July 14, 2011, the 2011 Israeli housing protests, in which hundreds of thousands of protesters from a variety of socio-economic and religious backgrounds in Israel protested against the continuing rise in the cost of living, particularly housing, and the deterioration of public services in the country, such as health and education. It was the largest social protest in the history of Israel, and peaked on September 3, 2011, when about 400,000 people demonstrated across the country. In October 2011, a deal was reached between Israel and Hamas, by which the kidnapped Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was released in exchange for 1,027 Palestinians and Arab-Israeli prisoners. In March 2012, Secretary-General of the Popular Resistance Committees, Zuhair al-Kazi, a senior PRC member, and 2 additional Palestinian militants were assassinated during a targeted killing carried out by Israeli forces in Gaza. In May 2012, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reached an agreement with the head of opposition Shaul Mofaz for Kadima to join the government, thus cancelling the early election supposed to be held in September. However, in July, the Kadima party left Netanyahu's government due to a dispute concerning military conscription for ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. In response to over 100 rocket attacks on southern Israeli cities, Israel began Operation Pillar of Defense in Gaza on November 14, 2012, with the targeted killing of Ahmed Jabari, chief of Hamas military wing, and airstrikes against 20 underground sites housing long-range missile launchers capable of striking Tel Aviv. In January 2013, construction of the barrier on the Israeli-Egyptian border was completed in its main section. Benjamin Netanyahu was elected prime minister again after the Likud Yisrael Beiteinu alliance won the most seats, 31, in the 2013 legislative election and formed a coalition government with secular centrist Yesh Atid Party, 19, rightist the Jewish Home, 12, and Livni's Hatnuah, 6, excluding Herodian parties. Labour came in third with 15 seats. In July 2013, as a goodwill gesture to restart peace talks with the Palestinian Authority, Israel agreed to release 104 Palestinian prisoners, most of whom had been in jail since before the 1993 Oslo Accords, including militants who had killed Israeli civilians. In April 2014, Israel suspended peace talks after Hamas and Fatah agreed to form a unity government. Following an escalation of rocket attacks by Hamas, Israel started Operation Protective Edge in the Gaza Strip on July 8, 2014, which included a ground incursion aimed at destroying the cross-border tunnels. Differences over the budget and a Jewish state bill triggered early elections in December 2014. After the 2015 Israeli elections, Netanyahu renewed his mandate as prime minister when Likud obtained 30 seats and formed a right-wing coalition government with Kulanu, 10, the Jewish Home, 8, and Orthodox parties Shas, 7, and United Torah Judaism, 6, the bare minimum of seats required to form a coalition. The Zionist Union Alliance came second with 24 seats. A wave of lone wolf attacks by Palestinians took place in 2015 and 2016, particularly stabbings. On December 6, 2017, President Donald Trump formally announced United States recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which was followed by the United States recognition of the Golan Heights as part of Israel on March 25, 2019. In March 2018, Palestinians in Gaza initiated the Great March of Return, a series of weekly protests along the Gaza-Israel border. The COVID-19 pandemic began in Israel with the first case detected in February 2020 and the first death being that of a Holocaust survivor in March 2020. 413 Israel Shield was the government's program to combat against the virus. Nationwide lockdowns and mask mandates were present throughout the country for much of 2020 into 2021, with the vaccination campaign beginning in December 2020 along with green passes. In late 2020, Israel normalized relations with 4 Arab League countries, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in September, known as the Abraham Accords, Sudan in October, and Morocco in December. In May 2021, after tensions escalated in Jerusalem, Israel launched Operation Guardian of the Walls, trading blows with Hamas for 11 days. The 2019-2022 political crisis featured political instability in Israel leading to 5 elections to the Knesset over a 4-year time period. The April 2019 and September 2019 elections saw no party able to form a coalition leading to the March 2020 election. This election again looked to result in deadlock, but due to the worsening COVID-19 pandemic, Netanyahu and blue and white leader, Benny Gantz, were able to establish a unity government with a planned rotating prime ministership where Netanyahu would serve first and later be replaced by Gantz. The coalition failed by December due to a dispute over the budget and new elections were called for March 2021. 2021 present, Bennett, Lapid, Netanyahu 3. See also, 36th and 37th Governments of Israel. Following the March 2021 election, Naftali Bennett signed a coalition agreement with Yair Lapid and different parties opposed to Netanyahu on the right, center, and left, whereby Bennett would serve as prime minister until September 2023 and then Lapid would assume the role until November 2025. An Israeli Arab Party, RAM, was included in the government coalition for the first time in decades. In June 2022, following several legislative defeats for the governing coalition, Bennett announced the introduction of a bill to dissolve the Knesset and call for new elections to be held in November. Yair Lapid became the new interim prime minister. After the 2022 elections, Netanyahu was able to return as prime minister under a coalition that included Likud, Shas, United Torah Judaism, Religious Zionist Party, Otzma Yehudit, and Noam, in what was described as the most right-wing government in the country's history. The government has overseen an uptick in violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, driven by military actions such as the July 2023 Jenin incursion as well as Palestinian political violence, producing a death toll in 2023 that is the highest in the conflict since 2005. In October 2023, the 2023 Israel-Hamas war started. The end.